My name is Adeline Harlow, and I am 29 years old. For 3 long years, my parents and my sister abandoned me in a remote Colorado cabin to care for our dying grandmother. I quit my job as an emergency room nurse. I spent every dime of my savings on her oxygen and medication. They did not visit once. They did not send a single dollar. But the morning of her funeral, they arrived in luxury rented cars demanding the keys to her estate so they could put it on the market. My father looked at my worn winter coat and told me I had 30 days to vacate the premises. What he did not know was that Grandma possessed a mind sharp as broken glass right up to the end. And what none of my family realized was that the quiet mountain notary who drank coffee with us every Tuesday was about to walk through the front door and hand them a bill for $285,000. Before I tell you what happened when the lawyer they brought tried to fight back, please take a second to like and subscribe to Orange Vengeance. Only do this if you believe people should face the consequences of their greed. Let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments. Here is how a freezing afternoon in Boulder changed my family forever. The wind coming off the flatirons carried a bite that cut straight through fabric and skin. I stood alone by the open earth of the mountain cemetery. The snow dusted the pine branches heavy and white above Clara Harlow's mahogany casket. I had pronounced death often enough in the Denver hospital to know the clinical reality of failing lungs. Yet standing there beside the woman who raised me when my own parents could not be bothered, the chill ran far deeper than the winter air. Then the sound of heavy tires crushing ice broke the mountain quiet. A fleet of pristine black SUVs idled near the cemetery gates. The doors opened in unison, disrupting the silence of the woods. My father Richard stepped out first. He wore a slate-gray cashmere overcoat that cost more than a standard nurse's monthly salary. My mother Susan followed. Her designer stiletto heels sank instantly into the frozen mud, prompting a sharp sigh of profound annoyance. Finally, my older sister Vanessa emerged, pulling a mink collar tight against her neck and visibly shivering. They had not driven up this mountain for 36 months. They missed Thanksgivings. They ignored phone calls during midnight oxygen panics. Yet they stood here now, impeccably dressed for a tragedy they refused to endure. They arranged their faces into masks of polite sorrow for the benefit of the few local groundskeepers working nearby. God, Adeline, could the town not have cleared the walking path? Vanessa asked. Her voice carried over the grave, sharp and nasal. She bypassed our grandmother's casket entirely and stopped a few feet from me to flick an imaginary snowflake from her sleeve. My toes are frozen. How do you tolerate this wilderness? I looked at her, tracking the familial resemblance I spent years trying to scrub from my own reflection. Richard approached, adjusting his silk tie. He offered a brief practice nod toward the grave. It was a hollow gesture meant for the onlookers. Scenic spot, he said, checking his luxury watch. Fitting. Listen, Adeline, we need to get out of this wind before someone catches pneumonia. You have the keys to the cabin, right? We will head up there, get unpacked, and start sorting through the estate paperwork. I brought my attorney along. He is meeting us at 4 to measure the property lines. I am a Colorado woman. We value the calluses on our hands. We do not feign loyalty, and we do not take what we fail to earn. I reached into the pocket of my coat, and my fingers traced the cold, jagged edge of the brass house key. I have the keys, Richard. I replied, my tone level against the howling wind. Follow me. I turned my back on them and walked toward my rusted, snow-dusted car. Let them complain about the mud. Let them mentally calculate the timber sales and the acreage values. They believed they were driving up this mountain to collect an effortless windfall. They had no inkling that Clara and I spent the last 3 years preparing for this exact afternoon, or that the true freeze waited for them behind the cabin door. As I navigated the winding mountain roads with their rented fleet tailing my bumper, my rearview mirror reflected the exact people who discarded me 36 months ago. The heater in my car rattled, blowing lukewarm air against the freezing windshield. Watching the pristine vehicles glide smoothly over the ice behind me gave me ample time to reflect on the life I had before they turned my compassion into a prison. 3 years ago, I was thriving. I worked as an emergency room nurse at a major trauma center in downtown Denver. My shifts were demanding, but I loved the rhythm of the hospital. I loved the adrenaline, the purpose, the feeling of pulling someone back from the edge. I rented an apartment I could afford, maintained a circle of friends I cherished, and built a career path that stretched bright and clear ahead of me. Then Clara received her diagnosis: terminal respiratory failure. The specialists gave her a few years at most, provided she received round-the-clock monitoring and specialized care. The solution should have been straightforward. Richard and Susan possessed ample wealth to hire private home aides or secure a room in a top-tier facility. Instead, they called a family meeting at their sprawling penthouse. I remember sitting on their pristine white sofa while my father paced the hardwood floor wearing a tailored suit. He explained that liquidating his investments to pay for Clara's care would incur unfavorable tax penalties. My mother sat beside me, patting my knee with manicured fingers. She looked at me with wide, sorrowful eyes and delivered the trap they had meticulously designed. "You have the medical license, Adeline," she said softly. "You are a registered nurse. It just makes sense for you to take point on this. We cannot trust strangers with your grandmother. The mountain cabin is quiet and the air is clean. It will be perfect for her." When I hesitated, pointing out that I had a lease and a demanding job, Richard leaned in to close the deal. He promised they would share the burden. He swore he would handle all the bills, cover the property taxes, and pay for the groceries. Susan promised she and Vanessa would drive up every single month to relieve me so I could rest and maintain my own life. They painted a picture of a united family stepping up during a crisis. They weaponized my nursing degree, using my oath to care for the sick as a tool to chain me to a remote log cabin. I gave notice at the hospital. I broke my lease. I packed my life into cardboard boxes and drove Clara up the mountain. Richard and Susan helped us move in, unloading the medical supplies and the heavy equipment. They stayed for exactly 2 hours. Then they hugged me, thanked me for being such a good granddaughter, and drove back down the mountain. That was the last time I saw them until today. The promises evaporated before their tire tracks faded from the snow. The visceral reality of my new existence set in with brutal swiftness. Colorado winters are unforgiving. The cabin sat off a dirt road that the county plows rarely cleared. The insulation was poor, and the drafting wind threatened to drop the indoor temperature to dangerous levels for Clara's fragile lungs. I became a prisoner to the wood stove. Every morning I woke up at 4 to haul logs from the shed, trudging through knee-deep snow in the biting darkness. I learned to swing an axe because buying pre-split wood cost money I quickly realized I would not receive. The physical toll of nursing a terminally ill patient alone drained the marrow from my bones. There were no hydraulic lifts in the rustic house. I deadlifted my grandmother multiple times a day to bathe her, change her bedding, and shift her position to prevent pressure ulcers. My back ached with a constant dull throb. My hands cracked and bled from the frigid dry air and the endless washing. I managed the heavy metal oxygen tanks, swapping them out when the gauges dropped, listening to the steady rhythmic hissing of the concentrator machine that became the soundtrack of my days. While I chopped firewood and monitored oxygen saturation levels, my sister lived an entirely different reality. During the rare moments Clara slept, I would sit by the fire and look at my phone. Vanessa populated her social media feed with a steady stream of luxury. There were photos of her sipping champagne on a yacht in Tulum, posing in front of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and skiing the groomed slopes of Aspen. Her captions always featured hollow phrases about the importance of family and cherishing every moment. She lived a life of leisure funded by our parents while I lived a life of indentured servitude. The silence of the mountain was deafening, but the silence from my family proved far worse. The phone never rang. The promised weekend visits never materialized. When I sent updates about Clara's declining health, Richard would reply days later with a brief thumbs-up emoji or a short text saying he was tied up in meetings. Susan stopped responding altogether, claiming the stress of the situation was too hard on her nerves. They did not want to know the ugly details of dying. They preferred to keep Clara out of sight and out of mind, leaving me to shoulder the entire terrifying burden of keeping her breathing. I watched the seasons change through the frost-covered windows of the cabin. Spring brought thick mud that trapped my car for weeks. Summer brought the constant threat of wildfires, forcing me to keep evacuation bags packed by the door. Fall brought the frantic rush to chop enough wood to survive another freeze. I lost my friends. I lost my career. I lost 3 years of my youth. The injustice of it crystallized during the second winter. A blizzard knocked out the power lines, leaving us relying on a loud, temperamental gasoline generator to run Clara's medical equipment. I stood in the freezing shed, yanking the pull cord until my palms blistered, begging the machine to start, so my grandmother would not suffocate. When the engine finally sputtered to life, I collapsed against the frozen woodpile and wept. I wept not from the cold, but from the profound realization of what my family had done to me. I was not a cherished daughter performing a noble sacrifice. I was free labor. I was the convenient dumping ground for their unwanted responsibilities. They viewed my medical expertise not as a hard-earned achievement, but as a free pass to protect their stock portfolios and their vacation schedules. They abandoned Clara to die, and they abandoned me to watch it happen. The first year broke me physically. The second year broke me emotionally. The third year reshaped me into something else entirely. I stopped waiting for the promised phone calls. I stopped asking Richard for the financial support he swore he would send. When my own savings account dwindled, I recognized the true depth of their betrayal. They did not just want to save money on a nursing home. They wanted to drain every resource I possessed until I was too exhausted and broke to ever fight back. As I steered my car around the final bend toward the cabin, I glanced in the mirror one more time. The line of black vehicles followed closely. They believed I was the same naive girl they manipulated 3 years ago. They thought my silence over the past few months meant I had simply accepted my role as the family martyr. They assumed my quiet endurance equated to weakness and submission. They were about to learn that the harsh mountain winters did not just callous my hands. The isolation burned away every ounce of gullibility I ever possessed, leaving behind a mind that was cold, calculating, and infinitely patient. I turned off the main road and my tires crunched onto the gravel driveway leading to the front porch. I shifted the car into park and turned off the ignition. The real game was about to begin. I stepped out of my rusted car, and the frigid air immediately bit at my exposed cheeks. Behind me, the 3 rented vehicles shifted into park simultaneously. The heavy doors swung open and my family emerged into the winter afternoon. Richard popped the trunk of his vehicle and began hauling out matching leather luggage. Susan complained about the lack of a paved walkway while pulling a cashmere scarf tighter around her throat to block the biting wind. Vanessa held a steaming cup of artisan coffee she must have purchased down in town before driving up the mountain. I watched them handle their expensive belongings with careless ease. That casual display of wealth twisted a very specific knife in my ribs. For 36 months, their opulence flourished, while my financial stability slowly bled out into the snow. The physical exhaustion of caring for Clara was brutal, but the financial exploitation was a deliberate, calculated suffocation. When I first drove Clara up this mountain, I possessed a robust savings account. Working overtime shifts in a Denver trauma center provided a comfortable cushion. I intended to use those funds for a down payment on a modest house. Instead, that money became the sole life support system for our grandmother. Giving up my hospital job meant severing my only source of income. At first, I believed the arrangement would be temporary. I assumed Richard would send the checks he promised during that family meeting, but the envelopes never arrived. The financial drain began with small, agonizing pebbles. It started with the realization that adult incontinence supplies cost $40 a box. Then came the specialty liquid nutrition, when Clara lost her ability to chew solid food safely. Every Tuesday, I would sit at the small wooden kitchen table, log into my banking app on my phone, and watch the numbers shrink. The blue glowing screen became a daily source of dread. I watched my hard-earned safety net dissolve just to keep the heat running and the medical cabinet stocked. I wore the same boots until the soles separated from the leather because replacing them meant sacrificing a week of Clara's pain medication. By the end of the first year, the panic set in deep and cold. The property taxes on the 40-acre estate were due, and the county sent a final notice warning of liens. I swallowed my pride and dialed my father's number. He did not answer. He rarely did. So I left a message explaining the dire situation, pleading for the funds he swore he would provide to protect his mother's home. 2 days later, he left a voicemail on my phone. I never deleted that audio file. I kept it saved, listening to it whenever I needed a reminder of who he truly was. His voice echoed through the tiny speaker, casual and breezy. "Adeline, sweetheart," he said, the audio clipping slightly over a gust of wind. I heard the distinct clinking of golf clubs in the background. "I received your message about the groceries and the tax bill. Listen, my liquid assets are tied up in some high-yield real estate investments right now. The market is fluctuating, and my financial advisor says I cannot pull anything out without taking a severe penalty. You understand how it is. Just put it on your credit card for now, and we will square up later. Gotta run, sweetheart. My tea time is in 5 minutes." The beep of that ending voicemail signaled the death of my naive loyalty. He was heading to a golf course while I was rationing canned soup to ensure Clara could afford her bronchodilator treatments. My family did not just abandon us physically, they actively turned me into their personal charity service. They assumed my intrinsic compassion as a nurse made me too soft to demand compensation. They calculated that I would rather bankrupt myself than let our grandmother freeze or starve. They were correct in assuming I would keep Clara alive, but they severely misjudged my response to their parasitism. I refused to drown quietly in the dark. I began treating my survival like a forensic audit. I sat at that rustic kitchen table night after night and calculated the brutal math of their neglect. A registered nurse in Colorado earns roughly $75,000 a year. Over 3 years, that equaled $225,000 in lost wages. But the hemorrhage did not stop there. The specialized oxygen concentrator required regular maintenance and replacement parts. The wooden ramp I hired a local carpenter to build over the front steps cost over $1,000. The property taxes totaled thousands more each winter just to keep the county at bay. The prescription medications, the sterile bandages, the heating oil required to keep the drafty cabin at a safe temperature for fragile lungs. All of it flowed directly out of my checking account. I paid for the privilege of keeping their mother alive. I did not weep over the negative balances or the maxed-out credit limits. Instead, I went to the local hardware store and purchased a heavy-duty fireproof lockbox and a thick stack of manila folders. Every time I bought a medical supply, I printed the receipt. Every time I paid the electric bill, I filed the invoice. Every time I drained my own account to cover the property taxes, I highlighted the transaction in bright yellow ink. I created meticulous spreadsheets logging every penny that left my possession. I transformed from a grieving, exhausted caregiver into a relentless record keeper. My family viewed my silence as submission. They thought I was a martyr, suffering in the woods, too paralyzed by familial duty to fight back. They failed to realize that silence is also the sound of someone diligently building an impenetrable case. I was not a victim. I was an archivist documenting every single slight, every dollar spent, and every broken promise for a future reckoning. The sound of a heavy suitcase rolling over frozen gravel snapped me back to the present moment. Richard stood at the base of the wooden porch steps, glaring at the frost-covered timber. He kicked a chunk of ice off the bottom step with his polished leather shoe, scowling at the rustic conditions. "Unlock the door, Adeline," Richard commanded, his breath pluming in the freezing mountain air. "It is freezing out here, and Susan is getting a headache from the altitude. We have a lot of ground to cover today, and I want to get the asset inventory started before the sun goes down." I looked at my father. I looked at the expensive leather bags holding their vacation clothes. Then I looked at the ramp I paid for with my own money so Clara could feel the sunshine on her face during her final summer. My heart beat with a steady, calm rhythm. The anger that once burned hot in my chest had long since condensed into something cold and precise. I pulled the brass key from my coat pocket and walked up the wooden ramp. The metal lock clicked, echoing sharply into the silent pine forest. I pushed the heavy oak door open, stepping aside to let the vultures enter the home they had refused to fund. They brushed past me, eager to claim their prize. They had no idea they were walking straight into the trap I had spent 3 years paying to build. As Richard and Susan crossed the threshold of the cabin, they immediately began cataloging the antique furnishings with greedy eyes. They operated under a profound delusion regarding my grandmother's final years. Whenever they spoke to their affluent country club friends down in the city, they painted a tragic picture claiming Clara had slipped into the dark fog of severe dementia. It was a highly convenient narrative. Framing her as a senile invalid justified their relentless absence and shielded them from any social scrutiny. The reality, however, was entirely different. Her lungs certainly betrayed her, turning every single breath into a grueling marathon of wheezing effort. But her cognitive faculties remained pristine and untarnished. Her intellect operated like a flawless diamond, cutting straight through the heavy isolation of the timber walls. She tracked every unreturned phone call and committed every missed holiday to memory. She understood exactly who her children had chosen to become. I recall a specific evening during our second autumn on the mountain. The cast iron wood stove radiated intense heat, pushing back against the plunging temperature outside. Clara sat in her padded medical recliner with a knitted afghan draped over her frail knees. Her gaze remained fixed on the glowing orange embers. She spoke with a fragile rasp that masked an unbreakable internal resolve. "Richard believes I am simply rotting away up here," she told me. "He thinks this 40-acre plot is nothing but a dormant bank account, waiting patiently for my pulse to finally stop." She knew my father had already scouted commercial developers from the Denver metropolitan area. She knew he communicated with corporate entities eager to flatten the ancient pine forest and subdivide the untouched ridge into sterile luxury vacation rentals. That chilling realization ignited a steady, quiet fury deep inside her fragile chest. We realized we needed a formidable ally. We required someone immune to the affluent intimidation tactics my father favored. We found that exact person in Brenda. Brenda served as a licensed Colorado notary public and lived as a lifelong resident of the nearby mining town. She drove a battered pickup truck, wore faded denim jackets, and possessed a spine forged from local iron ore. Her husband had perished in a logging accident a decade prior, leaving her to navigate the rugged high-altitude terrain alone. She recognized the unique grit it took to survive in these extreme elevations. When I first drove down to her small Main Street storefront to request a basic power of attorney document, she took one long look at my exhausted posture and instantly recognized a kindred spirit. Brenda started visiting the log cabin every Tuesday afternoon. She never arrived empty-handed. She always brought dented metal thermoses filled with strong, dark roast coffee and fresh baked pastries secured from the local diner. What began as a simple administrative visit quickly evolved into a vital weekly ritual. The three of us would sit around the scarred wooden dining table as the afternoon light faded into long blue shadows across the snowdrifts outside. The rhythmic hissing of the oxygen concentrator faded into the background, replaced by the crisp rustle of legal paper and the low murmur of strategic planning. My grandmother did not simply want to draft a revised last will and testament. A standard will must travel through the public probate court system. Probate is an arena where high-priced attorneys like the slick man Richard brought today could stall the proceedings for years. They could bleed the estate dry through endless petty litigation. Clara intended to deny them that specific battlefield. Instead, Brenda helped us construct a legal fortress designed to withstand any assault. We bypassed the standard procedures and established an irrevocable living trust. Clara painstakingly transferred the deed to the 40 acres, the log cabin, and every remaining liquid asset she held into that protected entity. The legal maneuvering required extreme precision. Brenda brought thick, heavy volumes of state property codes to the cabin. We read the fine print by the flickering light of kerosene lamps whenever the unreliable mountain power grid failed. We categorized every single dollar I spent on adult care, cross-referencing my meticulously saved receipts with formal promissory notes. Clara insisted on drafting an airtight employment contract, retroactively documenting my nursing services at the premium market rate. She signed every single page with a trembling but resolute hand, watching closely as Brenda pressed her official embossed metal stamp onto the thick paper. The heavy thud of that notary seal felt like a judge bringing down a gavel, locking the trap shut. Those Tuesday evenings became our ultimate sanctuary. The fire crackled, casting warm golden light across the room, while we orchestrated the downfall of the parasites who abandoned us. Clara would sip her dark coffee, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth as she visualized the eventual outcome. She wanted the land preserved and protected from the bulldozers and the greedy subdividers. More importantly, she wanted to ensure my financial future remained secure, compensating me for the career I sacrificed and the youth I surrendered. She transformed her impending death from a bleak tragedy into a masterful chess move. Brenda became fiercely protective of our covert operation. She locked the original signed documents in a fireproof vault at her office down in the valley, keeping duplicate copies secured in multiple undisclosed locations. She warned us about the legal loopholes wealthy heirs often exploited, ensuring we closed every single one of them. "If Richard tries to claim you coerced a dying woman," Brenda warned me one evening, tapping her pen against the thick trust binder, "we will bury him in certified medical records." She was a true mountain local, loyal to the core, and unafraid of men who wore silk ties and drove rented luxury vehicles. For 3 years, the outside world believed I was merely a broken caregiver, surviving day to day in the harsh wilderness. My family believed I was trapped. They thought my isolation made me weak, and my exhaustion made me compliant. They never once suspected that the freezing nights and the back-breaking labor had forged an iron bond between a dying matriarch, an exiled nurse, and a local notary. We built a legal fortress in total secrecy, operating right under their noses, while they were busy living their opulent lives. Now, watching my family step over the threshold of the cabin, bringing the cold winter air inside with them, the irony tasted sharp and sweet. They moved into the foyer with profound arrogance, carrying their expensive bags and their unearned confidence. They assumed this rustic home contained nothing but dust and fading memories ready to be swept away. They looked at the heavy timber walls and saw only dollar signs. I stood near the entryway, my hands tucked quietly into the pockets of my worn denim jeans. A profound calm washed over me. The anxiety that plagued my first year on this mountain had evaporated. The terror of financial ruin was gone. The 3 resilient women who sat around the fire had successfully insulated this property against the very intruders currently invading it. Every step Richard took across the hardwood floor only tightened the invisible snare wrapped tightly around his ankles. They did not understand that the true power in this room did not belong to the men in tailored suits or the women dripping in diamonds. The power belonged to the silent archivist, the sharp-minded matriarch, and the rugged local notary who held the keys to the kingdom. As the heavy oak door swung shut behind them, sealing us all inside, the stage was perfectly set. The storm they brought into the cabin was about to meet an immovable mountain, and the true invasion was only just beginning. The scent of lavender soap and sterile medical alcohol still lingered in the air of the log cabin. I stood motionless behind the butcher block kitchen island. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wide plank hardwood floors. Just 3 hours had passed since the groundskeepers lowered Clara into the frozen earth. The silence inside the house felt profound. It was a heavy stillness that settled into the corners of the room where the oxygen concentrator used to hum. I traced the grain of the wooden counter with my fingertip, waiting for the inevitable breach. The heavy oak front door swung open with a jarring thud, striking the interior wall. The mountain quiet shattered instantly. Richard marched over the threshold, dragging a massive hard-shell suitcase. The plastic wheels ground harsh tracks into the antique Persian rug, tracking a mixture of gray slush and road salt deep into the woven fabric. He did not bother to remove his shoes. Susan followed closely behind him, shivering theatrically while rubbing her gloved hands together. She surveyed the rustic living room with a look of undisguised distaste, as if inspecting a substandard hotel room. Vanessa trailed them, carrying two oversized designer tote bags and complaining loudly about the lack of a reliable cellular signal on the mountain. They were not alone. A fourth figure stepped through the doorway, bringing a distinctly corporate chill into the warm wooden sanctuary. Richard turned and gestured toward the newcomer. "This is Lawson," he announced, pointing to the man. "He is a senior partner at my estate firm back east. I flew him out to handle the liquidation logistics." Lawson possessed the polished, predatory appearance of a man who dismantles legacies for a living. He wore a sharp charcoal suit tailored far too thin for the harsh Colorado climate and expensive Italian loafers that offered zero traction on the ice. His eyes scanned the interior of the cabin, rapidly calculating square footage and structural integrity. He offered me a brief artificial smile that displayed perfectly bleached teeth before turning his attention back to the exposed timber ceiling beams. He treated my grandmother's home like a foreclosed property ripe for the taking. I remained silent behind the kitchen island, watching the invasion unfold. My pulse stayed steady. Susan unbuttoned her heavy coat, letting it drop onto the back of a hand-carved wooden rocking chair. The chair rocked backward, hitting the stone fireplace surround with a hollow knock. From her designer purse, she produced a thick pad of neon pink sticky notes and a silver pen. The sight of those small square papers turned my stomach. She handed half the pad to Vanessa. "We need to work quickly," Susan instructed her daughter. "The appraisal team arrives on Tuesday. Tag anything that looks like genuine antique furniture or original artwork. We will have an estate liquidator haul the rest to the county dump." Vanessa peeled a pink sticky note from the pad and slapped it onto a beautiful brass mantel clock. The clock belonged to my grandfather. He purchased it during his deployment in Europe decades ago. Clara cherished it, winding it every Sunday morning until her hands grew too weak. Vanessa did not see a lifetime of memories. She saw a quick auction sale. While Susan and Vanessa began tagging the living room furniture like vultures picking over a fresh carcass, Richard and Lawson moved toward the large picture windows facing the eastern ridge. The pristine 40-acre expanse of untouched pine forest rolled out beneath the glass. "The topography is highly favorable," Lawson remarked, pulling a laser measuring device from his suit pocket. "If we petition the county zoning board, we can easily subdivide this acreage into 5 distinct parcels. The demand for luxury, off-grid vacation builds is surging in the Boulder market right now." Richard nodded eagerly, rubbing his chin. "Exactly my thought, Lawson. We tear down this old structure and sell the raw lots. The timber rights alone will cover the demolition costs. We can clear the entire ridge before the summer building season begins." They spoke about destroying a sanctuary as if ordering lunch. They planned to obliterate the very trees Clara spent her final days gazing at through the glass. They intended to flatten the ecosystem that provided her peace. Vanessa emerged from the hallway leading to the primary bedroom. A triumphant smile played across her lips. In her hands, she carried a heavy, ornate wooden jewelry box lined with crushed blue velvet. She popped the brass latch and lifted the lid, admiring the strands of genuine pearls and vintage gold brooches inside. "I called dibs on these," Vanessa announced, pulling a delicate gold necklace from the box and holding it up against her throat. She admired her reflection in the dark window glass. "These vintage pieces are trending heavily online right now. I can probably fetch a fortune for the brooches alone." That box sat on Clara's nightstand every single day of her life. During the long, isolated nights when the pain grew unbearable, I would sit beside her bed, and she would open that box. She would tell me the story behind every single piece of jewelry, tracing the history of our family through the tarnished silver and faded gold. Vanessa violated that sacred space within 10 minutes of arriving. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from the kitchen island. I simply stood there, folding my arms across my chest, observing their grotesque behavior. My unblinking silence began to permeate the room. Susan paused while reaching to tag a painting. She glanced at me, shifting her weight uncomfortably under my steady gaze. Vanessa lowered the gold necklace, suddenly hyper-aware of the quiet judgment radiating from my side of the room. Even Lawson cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive tie. They expected me to weep. They anticipated a hysterical breakdown they could easily dismiss. My stoic observation unnerved them. Richard sensed the shifting atmosphere and decided to reassert his authority. He turned away from the window and marched toward the kitchen, stopping a few feet away from the island. He looked at me with the same patronizing expression he used when negotiating with subordinate employees. "Look, Adeline." Richard began resting his hands on his hips. "I know today is difficult for you. You spent a lot of time up here, and we appreciate you keeping an eye on things while we were busy. But we need to move forward efficiently. The real estate market moves fast, and holding on to a vacant property is a bad financial strategy." He paused, waiting for me to nod in agreement. I offered him nothing. "Lawson has the preliminary paperwork drafted." Richard continued, his tone hardening as my silence stretched on. "We are putting the cabin and the surrounding acreage on the market immediately. The contractors will arrive next week to start the demolition estimates." Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He extracted a glossy business card and tossed it onto the butcher block counter. It slid across the smooth wood, stopping inches from my hand. "Since we need to stage the property for buyers, you cannot stay here anymore," Richard stated flatly. "The presence of a tenant complicates the subdivision process. I am giving you a generous grace period. You have exactly 30 days to pack your belongings and vacate the premises." The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the air like toxic smoke. He stood in a home he never visited, concerning a mother he abandoned, demanding I surrender the only sanctuary I possessed. He delivered an eviction notice on the afternoon of a funeral. I looked down at the business card, then slowly raised my eyes to meet my father's arrogant stare. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the real war finally began. Lawson stepped out from behind my father, moving with the practiced glide of a man used to sweeping away the inconvenient debris of other people's lives. He reached inside his tailored charcoal jacket and produced a crisp white envelope, laying it flat on the wooden butcher block counter between us. He used 2 manicured fingers to slide it toward my hand. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and designed to make me feel small. Inside the unsealed envelope sat a standard formal eviction notice, printed on heavy legal paper. Tucked neatly beneath the notice was a business check drawn from Richard's primary corporate account. The amount written across the center read $5,000. Lawson offered a patronizing smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He adjusted his stance, adopting a tone of faux sympathy meant to placate a subordinate employee rather than address a grieving family member. "We understand this transition might feel abrupt," Adeline Lawson said, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. "But Richard and Susan want to ensure you are not left entirely destitute out here. Consider this check a generous severance for your informal nursing services. It should be more than enough to secure a small apartment down in the city while you search for new employment. We just need you to sign the acknowledgement of the eviction terms. $5,000. I stared at the printed numbers on the glossy paper. That sum covered less than a fraction of the property taxes I paid from my own savings to keep the county from auctioning this very cabin. It equated to merely a few weeks of the specialty liquid nutrition Clara required to survive her final agonizing months. It was a calculated insult. The check was designed to frame my 3 years of grueling medical labor as a casual favor worth nothing more than a minimal payout. Before I could even process the profound disrespect of the offer, my mother stepped forward to launch a coordinated offensive. Susan smoothed the front of her designer blouse and adopted a tone of maternal disappointment. She looked at me as if I were a rebellious teenager rather than a licensed medical professional who had just performed a miracle of end-of-life care. "Let us be honest about the situation." Adeline Susan sighed, crossing her arms over her chest. "You were struggling down in Denver. The emergency room shifts were clearly burning you out. You needed a place to crash and figure out your life. We allowed you to live here rent-free for 3 years. You had a solid roof over your head and no utility bills to worry about. We did you an enormous favor by letting you escape your responsibilities down in the city." The sheer psychological manipulation of her statement hung in the air like toxic smoke. Susan was attempting to rewrite history right in front of me. She took the sacrifice they demanded of me, the career they forced me to abandon, and the extreme isolation they condemned me to endure, and twisted it into a narrative of their own benevolence. They were erasing my suffering to alleviate their own buried guilt. Richard nodded in firm agreement, backing up his wife's fabricated reality. Exactly, he chimed in, pointing a stiff finger at me. Most parents would have charged you monthly rent for occupying a prime piece of real estate like this. We let you hide out up here in the woods because we knew you could not handle the pressure of the real world. We subsidized your little mountain retreat for 36 months. Now the free ride is over. The coordinated attack was meant to suffocate me. They were using their combined numbers, their wealth, and their hired attorney to back me into a psychological corner. They needed to break my spirit quickly, before I could mount any sort of defense. Then Vanessa decided to strike the lowest blow. She turned away from the antique cabinet holding a pair of Clara's vintage silver candlesticks in her hands. Her eyes narrowed with petty venom. And let us talk about the money, Vanessa sneered, stepping closer to the kitchen island. We all know Grandma received regular monthly Social Security deposits. She had a pension from her teaching days. Where did all that cash go, Adeline? You were the only one up here with access to her bank accounts. Did you skim those funds to pay off your own personal credit cards? You have been living off an old woman's government aid while pretending to be some kind of saint. The accusation echoed off the heavy timber walls. Vanessa, who was currently holding stolen silver in her bare hands, stood there and called me a thief. She had no idea that Clara's meager pension barely covered the cost of her supplemental insurance premiums, let alone the heating oil required to keep the cabin from freezing. The audacity was breathtaking. They were publicly eradicating my immense sacrifice, painting me as a parasitic moocher to justify cutting me out of the estate entirely. They needed to make me the villain of their story so they could play the victims who were simply reclaiming their rightful property from a squatter. I looked at the four of them standing in a tense semicircle around the kitchen island. Lawson with his smug smirk, Richard with his puffed-up arrogance, Susan with her fake maternal concern, Vanessa with her biting jealousy. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. They were trying to crush me under the weight of their collective delusion. If they repeated the lie loud enough, they believed it would become the truth. I thought back to the woman I was 3 years ago, the Denver emergency room nurse who sat on their pristine white sofa and agreed to give up her life because she believed in family duty. That version of Adeline would have cracked under this immense pressure. She would have felt the familiar hot sting of tears welling in her eyes. She would have raised her voice, desperate to defend her honor. She would have scrambled to pull out the credit card statements and the grocery receipts, begging them to look at the truth, begging them to acknowledge her worth. But that version of Adeline died during the first brutal Colorado winter. The woman standing behind the butcher block counter had been forged in the freezing isolation of the Rocky Mountains. You cannot survive chopping cordwood in sub-zero temperatures if you let the cold break you. You cannot lift a dying woman from a medical bed a dozen times a day if your spine is made of glass. The sheer physical and emotional endurance required to keep Clara alive had burned away every trace of my fragile need for their approval. I did not need them to see my worth. I knew exactly what I was capable of enduring, and I knew exactly what kind of coward stood before me. I felt my pulse slow to a steady rhythmic beat. The anger that should have boiled over instead froze into a sharp, clear glacier inside my chest. I looked at the $5,000 check sitting on the counter. I looked at the eviction notice. I did not reach for either of them. Instead, I let the silence stretch. I let the quiet of the mountain cabin amplify their harsh breathing and their shifting feet. They expected a fight. They expected me to scream or cry, giving them the excuse to call me hysterical and unstable. When I did nothing, their confident postures began to show slight hairline fractures of uncertainty. Lawson dropped his patronizing smile. Vanessa shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clutching the silver candlesticks tighter. I placed both of my hands flat on the cool wood of the kitchen island. I looked directly into my father's eyes, then shifted my gaze to my mother, then my sister, and finally the sleazy lawyer they brought to intimidate me. The drive up the mountain must have been exhausting for all of you, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, steady register that betrayed zero emotion. The roads are treacherous this time of year, and the high altitude can make people dizzy. It can make people say things that do not make any sense. Susan opened her mouth to argue, but I raised a single finger, silencing her instantly. The authority in my subtle gesture was undeniable. It was the same command I used when directing trauma staff in the emergency room. We have a lot of paperwork to discuss today. I continued, keeping my tone as smooth as river glass. But we are not going to do it standing in the kitchen like barbarians. Take off your coats. Put the jewelry and the silver back exactly where you found it. Go into the dining room and sit down at the table. Richard scoffed, his face reddening with fresh indignation. I am not taking orders from you in my own house, Adeline. Sit down, Richard, I replied, the command slicing through the room with icy precision. I turned my back on all four of them and walked toward the heavy cast-iron wood stove in the corner of the kitchen. I picked up the copper kettle and carried it to the sink. The sound of running water filled the tense silence. I was not going to break. I was going to serve them tea. I carried the heavy copper kettle to the cast-iron wood stove, situated in the corner of the rustic kitchen. The dark metal surface still radiated a deep, steady heat from the morning fire I had stoked hours earlier. I placed the kettle on the hottest iron plate and listened to the water begin its slow, inevitable simmer. Behind me, the silence in the room stretched tight and brittle. My father, his hired lawyer, my mother, and my sister stood frozen in the dining area. They did not know how to process a target who refused to bleed on command. I reached into the upper wooden cabinet and retrieved a large glass jar filled with dried chamomile flowers. Clara and I harvested those delicate yellow buds late last summer, drying them on wire screens in the warm mountain sun. I measured exact scoops into a large ceramic teapot. The methodical routine of brewing the drink centered my breathing and slowed my heart rate. I could hear Susan shifting her weight nervously on the hardwood floor, adjusting her posture. The sheer absence of my panic unsettled them deeply. They wanted a chaotic argument. They desired a screaming match to validate their narrative that I was an unstable, exhausted caregiver who had lost her grip on reality. By offering them nothing but the domestic tranquility of preparing a hot beverage, I stripped away their expected script and left them grasping for control. Let me share a fundamental truth about arrogant people. Arrogance cannot tolerate a vacuum. When you stop defending yourself and simply let quiet stretch out across a room, arrogant individuals will always rush to fill the empty space. They perceive silence as a void they must conquer and dominate. They mistake patience for submission and calmness for surrender. Up here in the Colorado high country, you learn to wait. You watch the brutal winter storms roll over the jagged ridges, and you understand that rushing blindly into the freezing wind only gets you killed. City people, like my family, operate on an entirely different frequency. They measure their power by volume and aggressive speed. They believe the loudest voice in the room always wins the negotiation. But if you stand perfectly still and offer them zero resistance, they will gladly take the shovel you offer and dig their own graves. They will talk and talk until they expose every greedy intention they harbor deep inside. I stood by the stove watching the white steam rise from the kettle spout, and I waited patiently for them to start digging. The water reached a vigorous rolling boil. I poured it over the dried flowers, watching the clear liquid turn a soft, golden hue. I arranged 4 heavy stoneware mugs on a wooden serving tray and carried it straight into the dining room. Richard, Susan, Vanessa, and Lawson had taken their seats around the long oak table. They looked like a corporate boardroom meeting superimposed over a rustic hunting lodge. I set the wooden tray down in the center of the table, pushing a steaming mug toward each of them with deliberate care. I took the final seat at the far end, folding my hands politely in my lap. Richard exchanged a knowing, smug glance with his attorney. I saw my father's rigid shoulders relax significantly. The tense hostility drained from his posture, replaced by a sickening wave of triumphant satisfaction. In his calculated mind, my act of serving tea represented total capitulation. He believed he had successfully broken my spirit with the formal eviction notice and the insulting severance check. He leaned back in his wooden chair, steepled his fingers together, and turned his attention back to his hired counsel. The local zoning board meets on the second Tuesday of the month, Richard noted, taking a confident sip of the hot liquid. We need the preliminary topographical survey completed by then Lawson. I want the subdivision permits expedited through the county clerk office. Lawson nodded smoothly, pulling a silver pen from his tailored suit pocket to jot rapid notes on a yellow legal pad. We can file an expedited petition based on the estate settlement timeline. The real immediate value here is the clear cutting. We can bring in commercial loggers to strip the entire eastern ridge before the frost fully thaws and the ground turns to mud. The timber yield on 40 acres of mature pine will easily cover all of our administrative fees, the lawyer retainers, and the demolition costs of this primary structure. Richard smiled, tapping his fingers on the table surface. Excellent strategy. Once the ancient trees are gone, we grade the land and plot the luxury building lots. The unobstructed mountain views will fetch a premium price from out-of-state investors. Vanessa picked up her stoneware mug, holding it by the thick handle with two manicured fingers. She wrinkled her nose, inspecting the heavy clay glaze as if it might contaminate her pristine skin. "Could we not find any actual porcelain to drink from?" she complained, staring down into the golden liquid with profound disgust. "This mug weighs 10 pounds. It feels like I am drinking dirt out of a cheap flower pot. And this tea tastes like wet grass. Did you just boil random weeds from the backyard, Adeline?" Susan patted Vanessa's arm, offering a sympathetic sigh, meant to placate a spoiled child. "Your sister has been living like a hermit in the woods for 3 years, darling. You cannot expect civilized hospitality or refined taste. We will be back in Denver by dinner time, and we can get a proper meal at that new bistro downtown. Just humor her for a few more minutes until your father finalizes the liquidation timeline." They sat around the very table Clara bought with her first teaching paycheck. Drinking the tea, Clara grew in her own garden, planning the utter destruction of the trees Clara loved more than anything. They discussed logging operations and luxury real estate profit margins, while the ghost of the woman who gave them everything still lingered in the very room they planned to bulldoze into dust. They felt entirely untouchable. They operated with the blind, unearned confidence of corporate predators who believed the hunt was already over and the prey had surrendered. I sat at the end of the oak table listening to the rhythmic ticking of the antique mantel clock. I did not touch my own drink. I kept my eyes fixed on the large picture window facing the dirt driveway. The winter sun had dipped below the jagged mountain peaks, casting the dense pine forest in deep shades of violet and gray. The frigid wind howled against the thick glass, rattling the wooden window frames and signaling a dropping temperature. Then a pair of bright yellow headlights swept across the snow-covered yard. The twin beams of light cut through the gathering darkness, illuminating the falling snowflakes. The vehicle turned off the main county road and crunched onto the gravel driveway leading to the porch. The heavy rumbling engine of a battered pickup truck vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin, echoing in the quiet room. Richard stopped mid-sentence, setting his stoneware mug down with a dull thud. He frowned, looking past me toward the frosted window pane. "Are you expecting a late delivery?" Richard asked, his tone laced with sudden, sharp irritation. "I specifically told the real estate appraiser to come tomorrow morning. We do not have time for local interruptions today." A heavy, confident knock sounded at the thick oak front door. The sound echoed through the quiet house, delivering 3 sharp raps that struck the wood like a judge's gavel calling a courtroom to order. Vanessa jumped slightly in her chair, spilling a few drops of hot tea onto her designer blouse. She hissed in annoyance, dabbing frantically at the expensive fabric with a paper napkin. Lawson narrowed his eyes, looking from the front door back to me. The smug satisfaction began to drain from the room, replaced by a sudden creeping uncertainty that lowered the temperature at the table. I stood up from my chair, slowly smoothing the front of my denim jeans. I looked down the length of the long wooden table, meeting my father's confused and irritated gaze. A soft, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth for the first time that day. "Before you sell the timber, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly and firmly through the silent room, "there is a guest who needs a cup of tea." I turned away from the table and walked toward the entryway. The heavy footsteps of my winter boots sounded loud against the hardwood floor. My family watched me in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the subtle but profound shift in the atmosphere. They thought they brought the final devastating storm to this mountain. They had no idea I was about to open the door and let the avalanche inside. I grabbed the cold iron handle and pulled the heavy oak door inward. The biting winter wind rushed into the foyer, carrying a swirl of loose snow that melted instantly against the warm floorboards. Standing on the frozen porch was Brenda. She wore her signature faded denim jacket lined with thick sheepskin and heavy-duty work boots caked with fresh mountain mud. Her graying hair was pulled back into a severe knot, defying the gale-force gusts whipping around her shoulders. Tucked securely under her right arm, she clutched a thick, leather-bound folder. It looked worn but official, the kind of folio that carried undeniable consequence. She stepped over the threshold without waiting for an invitation, stamping her boots on the woven welcome mat to dislodge the packed ice. I closed the door, shutting out the howling storm. The sudden isolation of the cabin amplified the tension radiating from the dining room. Richard pushed his chair back and stood up. His face flushed with immediate indignation at the intrusion. He viewed the local townsfolk as little more than background scenery serving his pristine vacation destination. "Excuse me," Richard barked, taking a step toward the foyer. "The cabin is closed to visitors today. We are dealing with private family business. You need to leave." Brenda did not even glance in his direction. Decades spent navigating the rough-and-tumble world of local loggers and hardened miners had fortified her against the bluster of angry men in expensive suits. She shrugged off the cold, unbuttoning her thick jacket with calm, deliberate movements. She knew the exact power she held tucked beneath her arm. Lawson stood up next, adjusting his silk tie and stepping forward to present a united front with his wealthy client. He plastered on his signature artificial smile, projecting the false authority of a man used to commanding a courtroom. "Ma'am, I am the retained legal counsel for the Harlow estate," Lawson stated, his voice slick and projecting across the room. "We are currently liquidating the assets and conducting an inventory. Whatever local business you have with the deceased needs to be routed through my office in Denver. I can give you a card to contact my paralegal on Monday." Brenda finally stopped brushing the snow from her sleeves. She walked past the kitchen island and entered the dining room. She bypassed my father and his attorney, entirely moving with an undeniable mountain-bred authority. She walked straight to the head of the long oak table, taking the seat that Richard had presumed was his by birthright. She placed the heavy leather-bound folder squarely on the wood right next to the tray of steaming chamomile tea. "I am Brenda Vance," she announced, her voice clear and carrying the weight of the high-altitude rocks. "I serve as a licensed notary public for the state of Colorado, and you are standing in a house that does not belong to you." Richard scoffed, crossing his arms over his cashmere sweater. "What sort of ridiculous performance is this? My mother passed away this morning. I am her eldest son and the primary executor of her estate. Lawson has the documented will right here in his briefcase." Lawson smoothly unlatched his leather bag and produced a crisp manila envelope. He pulled out a stapled stack of legal paper, tossing it onto the table with a theatrical flourish. "Last will and testament of Clara Harlow," Lawson recited, tapping the top page with his manicured index finger. "Executed and filed in 2018. It clearly stipulates the division of all assets, including this property, to her direct descendants. We hold the legal high ground here. So unless you are here to offer condolences, I suggest you exit the premises before I call the county sheriff and report a trespasser." Brenda reached out and poured herself a mug of the hot golden tea I had brewed. She took a slow, appreciative sip, letting the heat warm her hands. She looked at Lawson the way a seasoned mechanic looks at a flat tire. It was an expression of mild inconvenience rather than actual concern. 2018 was a long time ago, Counselor, Brenda said, setting the stoneware mug down. People change their minds, especially when they realize the people named in those old documents have not bothered to show up for 3 years. She unclasped the brass buckle on her leather folder and flipped it open. Inside sat a pristine stack of thick ivory paper stamped with multiple official seals and bound by a dark blue ribbon. The document looked formidable and precise. What I hold here, Brenda continued tapping the ivory paper, is the finalized, irrevocable living trust of Clara Harlow. It was legally executed, notarized, and filed exactly 14 days ago. Lawson let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. A living trust drafted 2 weeks before death. That is adorable. But it means nothing. A woman in the final stages of terminal respiratory failure does not possess the mental capacity to execute complex estate planning. We will drag that document into probate court and invalidate it before the snow melts. You are wasting your time. Brenda leaned forward, resting her forearms on the oak table. The quiet intensity in her eyes made Lawson falter. She was not a city lawyer playing legal games. She was the executioner delivering a fatal blow to their greed. You clearly do not understand Colorado state property law, Brenda informed him, her tone clinical and devastatingly precise. A properly funded living trust does not enter probate. The assets do not go before a judge. Clara transferred the deed to these 40 acres, the log cabin, the mineral rights, and every single liquid asset she owned into this protected entity prior to her death. There is no estate left for your outdated will to claim. The transition of ownership occurred the moment her heart stopped beating. The smug demeanor that Richard had worn since arriving at the cemetery began to visibly fracture. The color drained from his face as the reality of her words penetrated his arrogant armor. He looked at Lawson, expecting his high-priced attack dog to shred the argument. But Lawson was staring at the thick ivory document with a sudden creeping dread. The attorney recognized the official county registrar stamps running along the margins of the paper. He knew a bulletproof legal filing when he saw one. Susan gripped the edge of the dining table, her knuckles turning white. "This is fraud," she hissed, her voice trembling with rising panic. "You and Adeline conspired to steal our inheritance while Clara was vulnerable." Vanessa slammed her hands on the table, rattling the teacups. "I do not care about your stupid legal jargon," she yelled, glaring at Brenda. "Tell us what the actual document says. Who gets the money? Who gets the land?" Brenda reached into the pocket of her flannel shirt and retrieved a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses. She unfolded them carefully and placed them on the bridge of her nose. She did not rush. She let the agonizing suspense suffocate the 4 interlopers who had invaded my grandmother's home. She turned to the second page of the living trust, smoothing the heavy paper flat against the table. She raised her head and looked directly into my father's eyes. The silence in the dining room became absolute. The wind howling against the picture windows seemed to fade into the background. Every breath in the room caught in anticipation. Brenda cleared her throat and began to read Clara's final words aloud. "I, Clara Harlow, being of sound mind and pristine memory, do hereby establish this trust to dictate the final distribution of my life's work. I do this with full knowledge of the choices my family has made during my twilight years. I possess no illusions regarding their absence. I recognize that the blood in their veins does not equate to loyalty in their hearts." Brenda paused, letting the harsh truth of the opening declaration settle over the table. Richard swallowed hard, his jaw muscles ticking with suppressed rage. Susan looked down at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the local notary, who was currently exposing their deepest shame. Therefore, Brenda continued, her voice steady and echoing through the rustic timber cabin. "I hereby revoke, nullify, and void any and all previous wills, testaments, and estate plans drawn prior to this date. The assets contained within this trust shall not be divided equally. They shall not be sold to commercial developers. They shall not enrich those who abandon me to face the dark alone." The room fell dead silent. The true weight of Clara's profound foresight crashed down upon the family. The realization that they were not merely dealing with a grieving granddaughter, but a meticulously orchestrated legal ambush, began to paralyze them. The trap they walked into was not built on emotion. It was built on ink paper and the undeniable vengeance of a matriarch who saw them exactly for who they were. Brenda adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and continued reading from the thick ivory paper. The timber walls of the cabin seemed to lean inward, listening to the final judgment of Clara Harlow. The fire crackled in the cast-iron stove, providing the only sound beneath the steady cadence of the notary's voice. "I direct that the entirety of my estate," Brenda read, her tone clear and unwavering, This includes the 40-acre parcel of pristine mountain ridge, the primary log residence, all associated timber and mineral rights, and every remaining dollar of liquid capital held in my name. These assets shall not be divided. They shall be transferred exclusively and irrevocably to the single individual who provided verifiable round-the-clock medical and physical care during the final 36 months of my terminal illness. Richard stopped breathing. He sat frozen in his wooden chair, staring at the leather-bound folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The vast multi-million-dollar empire he had already spent in his mind was evaporating right in front of his eyes. Brenda did not pause to let them recover. She followed the text down the page, delivering the fatal blow Clara had spent 3 years sharpening. Furthermore, I explicitly and intentionally disinherit my son, Richard Harlow, my daughter-in-law Susan Harlow, and my granddaughter Vanessa Harlow. Brenda enunciated every single syllable of their names, ensuring the gravity of their erasure echoed through the room. I leave them nothing. I make this decision with a clear mind and a heavy heart due to their profound failure to provide any emotional support, physical assistance, or financial contribution during my greatest hour of need. They chose their own comfort over my survival, and therefore they forfeit any claim to the legacy I leave behind. Susan let out a sharp, strangled gasp, pressing her manicured hand over her mouth. The performative grief she wore at the cemetery dissolved instantly, replaced by genuine, undisguised horror. She looked at Richard, demanding him to fix the situation, to wave his hand and make the bad news disappear just like he always did back in the city. But Richard looked entirely paralyzed. The man who ruthlessly acquired rival companies and fired loyal employees without a second thought could not comprehend being on the receiving end of a corporate termination. Clara had evaluated his worth and found him severely lacking. She had fired him from the family. Lawson, the slick out-of-state attorney, realized his lucrative percentage of the timber sale was vanishing into the thin mountain air. He could not afford to lose this commission. A layer of nervous sweat broke out across his forehead, shining in the dim light of the dining room. He stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back so hard it screeched against the hardwood floor. He slammed his palms flat on the oak table, attempting to project a false aura of legal dominance. "Hold on a minute," Lawson interjected, his voice rising an octave higher than before. "This is a clever piece of theater, but it will not hold up under judicial scrutiny in a legitimate courtroom." Brenda looked up from the document, peering over the rims of her reading glasses. She observed the desperate lawyer with the mild curiosity of a local watching a tourist stumble blindly into a snowdrift. "Is that right?" Counselor Brenda asked, her voice calm and remarkably steady. "Please enlighten us on which specific statute invalidates a notarized living trust in this jurisdiction." Lawson pointed a trembling finger toward me, where I sat quietly at the end of the table. "You are relying on a caregiver clause to justify transferring the entire estate to Adeline," Lawson stated, speaking rapidly to build momentum. "But state law makes distinct categorizations regarding end-of-life care. Adeline is a direct blood relative. She is the granddaughter of the deceased. The court will view her actions over the past 3 years as duties performed out of natural familial affection, not professional obligation." Lawson stood taller, believing he had found the perfect technicality to shred our defense. "Without a formal employment agreement, her time up here is legally classified as a personal favor." He argued, a smug grin returning to his slick face. "You cannot inherit an entire estate based on a caregiver clause if you were never officially recognized as a contracted employee. She was just a granddaughter helping out. This trust is built on a fundamental legal flaw, and I will file an injunction tomorrow morning to freeze every single asset." My father let out a long, heavy sigh of relief, running a hand through his expensive silver hair. He looked at Lawson with profound gratitude, silently thanking the lawyer for finding the exact loophole they needed to tear my inheritance away. Vanessa sat up straighter, a haughty smirk crossing her lips as she prepared to reclaim her position of superiority. They thought they had won. They thought their expensive legal education and their city tactics could outsmart 2 women sitting by a wood stove in the middle of nowhere. They failed to realize that Clara possessed a pioneer spirit. She built this life from the ground up, and she knew how to secure her perimeter against wolves. Brenda did not argue with Lawson. She did not raise her voice or try to debate the nuances of family law. She simply reached down and pinched the top corner of the heavy ivory paper. With a crisp rustle, she flipped to the next page in the leather folder. "You raise a very valid point regarding the legal definition of a professional caregiver," Lawson, Brenda noted, nodding in mock agreement. "A court would certainly require documented proof of employment to validate the transfer of such significant assets. It is a good thing Clara despised loose ends." Brenda turned the folder around and pushed it across the smooth oak table, stopping right in front of the sweating attorney. Lawson looked down at the page. The color drained out of his face, leaving his skin the shade of dirty chalk. Sitting on top of the stack was a formalized, standardized, and heavily stamped employment contract. "I suggest you read the second paragraph," Brenda offered, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms over her flannel shirt. Lawson picked up the document, his hands shaking noticeably. He read the text in silence, his eyes darting back and forth across the page. "Clara and I had drafted that specific contract during my second month on the mountain, right after Richard had refused to pay the property taxes. It detailed my exact professional credentials, listing my active registered nurse license number with the State Board of Nursing. It established me as an independent medical contractor hired by Clara Harlow to provide palliative care medication management and physical therapy. More importantly, the contract stipulated a premium hourly market rate for my services. Because Clara lacked the liquid funds to pay me a standard weekly paycheck, the contract featured a deferred compensation clause. I was officially a secured creditor of the estate, earning a professional wage that accrued daily for 36 consecutive months. She was not acting out of natural familial affection, Brenda stated, delivering the final crushing blow to their legal theory. She was operating under a binding, notarized employment contract. Adeline was the sole contracted medical provider for this property. The caregiver clause in the living trust is airtight, unassailable, and permanently locked. The silence that followed was total and devastating. The mathematical reality of their situation crashed down upon them. They were legally shut out. They had zero claim to the timber, the land, or the antique silver. They possessed no loopholes and no technicalities left to exploit. I looked at Vanessa. My older sister had spent the last 3 years posting photos from pristine beaches while I scrubbed medical equipment in freezing water. She came up this mountain expecting to walk away with a fortune in vintage jewelry and a hefty cut of a multi-million-dollar land sale. Now she sat in a wooden chair staring at the undeniable proof that her own greed had cost her everything. Her jaw hung open slightly. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled in her lap. The shock contorting her face provided the ultimate karmic payoff. She looked at the heavy brass mantel clock she had tagged for the auction block, realizing she would never touch it again. Richard stared at the employment contract, unable to form a coherent sentence. His entire empire-building strategy had collapsed within a span of 10 minutes. But as I watched his initial shock curdle into dark brewing anger, I knew the confrontation was far from over. Cornered predators do not surrender quietly. They lash out. And as Lawson opened his mouth to launch a desperate counterattack, I braced myself for the final staggering revelation Clara had prepared for them. The heavy silence hung over the long oak table like a thick winter fog. Lawson stared down at the employment contract, unable to conjure a single legal argument. Losing the real estate portfolio dealt a staggering blow to their financial ambitions. But Clara harbored one more revelation designed to inflict a far deeper wound. She intended to strip them of their false dignity. Brenda reached back into the depths of her weathered leather folder. The crisp rustle of shuffling paper broke the suffocating tension in the dining room. She withdrew a thick stack of printed spreadsheets bound by a heavy brass clip. She did not hand the stack to the attorney right away. She held it resting her calloused hands on the table surface. Clara did not just secure the deed to this property, Brenda stated, her voice steady and commanding. She also kept a meticulous record of the survival costs. My grandmother possessed an immaculate mind for accounting. During her younger years, she managed the bookkeeping for my grandfather's construction business down in the valley. Her lungs failed her, but her aptitude for numbers remained pristine. Every Tuesday evening, while we drank our chamomile tea, Clara would ask me to bring the fireproof lockbox to the kitchen island. She would smooth out the wrinkled grocery receipts, the pharmacy printouts, and the utility invoices. She recorded every single penny that left my bank account. Brenda unclipped the binding and slid a copy of the spreadsheet toward Lawson. She then distributed identical copies to Richard, Susan, and Vanessa. The document bore the title, The Ledger. I watched my father's eyes scan the top row of the printed columns. He read the exact cost of the custom wooden ramp built over the front steps. He read the price of the heavy-duty snow tires required to navigate the treacherous icy roads during January blizzards, so I could fetch prescription medications. Susan looked at the line items detailing the sterile bandages, the adult incontinence supplies, and the specialized liquid nutrition. The sheer volume of the itemized list forced them to confront the grueling, unglamorous reality of end-of-life care. They could no longer hide behind their willful ignorance. Brenda tapped her own copy of the ledger with her index finger. You will notice the largest sum spans the third column, she pointed out. Clara calculated Adeline's deferred compensation based on the standard Denver hospital rate for a licensed registered nurse. She logged every daytime shift, every overnight vigil, and every weekend rotation. She accounted for holiday pay. Vanessa flipped to the final page of the document. Her breath hitched in her throat. She dropped the paper onto the table as if it burned her manicured fingers. At the bottom of the ledger, printed in bold black ink, sat the staggering final calculation. $285,000. Lawson cleared his throat, adjusting his collar to buy a few seconds of recovery time. This is an impressive invoice, he muttered, trying to project a dismissive tone. It shows a touching level of dedication. But estate debts are settled during probate proceedings, which you just proudly admitted bypassing. The trust insulates the property, but it also leaves unsecured creditors out in the cold. My clients owe her nothing. Brenda offered a cold, knowing smile. You are missing the penalty clause, counselor. She instructed them to turn to page 6 of the living trust document. Clara anticipated your exact litigation strategy, Brenda explained. She knew wealthy heirs always try to bleed out the rightful beneficiaries through endless court battles and frivolous injunctions. She watched Richard use those exact tactics against rival business partners, so she installed a legal firewall. The room remained perfectly still as Lawson scanned the 6th page. The color that had just started to return to his face vanished again. The trust explicitly stipulates, Brenda continued, her voice echoing with undeniable finality, that any individual attempting to contest the validity of this document must first settle the outstanding medical debt owed to the primary caregiver. Before a judge will even schedule a preliminary hearing or entertain a motion for an injunction, your clients must deposit the full $285,000 into a secure escrow account to back pay Adeline. The trap Clara designed was exquisite. She financially weaponized their own greed against them. If my family walked away, they lost a multi-million-dollar mountain estate. If they chose to fight, they had to surrender over $250,000 in liquid cash just to buy a ticket to the courtroom. They could not use the estate assets to fund the lawsuit because the assets were locked. They would have to write a personal check dipping into the very investment portfolios they fought so hard to protect. I watched my mother stare at the detailed ledger. Just 10 minutes ago, she sat in this room and called me a freeloader. She claimed they generously subsidized my rustic retreat. Now she held a notarized spreadsheet detailing the exact monetary value of her profound neglect. She held the receipts for the oxygen tank deliveries she refused to fund. The false narrative of the parasitic granddaughter disintegrated into dust right before her eyes. They could not claim I was a moocher when holding the itemized proof of my sacrifices. The emotional atmosphere in the cabin shifted from shock to utter humiliation. The numbers on the page screamed loud enough for everyone. I forced them to read the precise price tag of my stolen youth. Richard clenched his jaw, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The reality of the ledger stripped away his illusion of control. He always solved his problems by writing checks or threatening litigation. Clara constructed a scenario where writing a check equated to admitting defeat and threatening litigation required bankrupting his own pride. He looked at the long list of expenses, recognizing the dates that corresponded with his luxury golf trips and his high-end corporate retreats. "Every time you ignored my phone calls, Richard," I said, breaking my silence and letting my voice carry across the oak table the meter was running. "Every time you told me your assets were tied up, Clara logged the interest. You thought you were saving money by leaving me up here to shoulder the burden alone. You were actually financing your own eviction." Susan crumpled the corner of the spreadsheet, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "You planned this," she whispered, her voice laced with venom. "You sat up here playing the victim while scheming to steal our inheritance. You manipulated a sick old woman into signing her life away." "I did not need to manipulate anyone, Susan," I replied, my tone remaining cool and detached. Clara possessed eyes and ears. She watched me haul firewood through the snowstorms while you posted pictures from tropical resorts. She listened to the voicemail where Richard told me to put her groceries on a credit card. She did not leave this property to me out of spite. She left it to me because I am the only person who actually paid for it. The undeniable logic of my statement hung over them. The ledger served as a mirror reflecting their grotesque selfishness back at them. They could no longer hide behind the polite society excuses they manufactured down in the city. The ledger quantified their abandonment down to the final cent. It proved they were not grieving heirs reclaiming a legacy. They were negligent cowards attempting a robbery. Lawson sat back in his chair, closing his leather briefcase with a quiet click. He recognized a losing hand. He understood that fighting a certified medical professional armed with ironclad contracts and a $250,000 penalty clause represented a swift path to professional embarrassment. The slick attorney who marched into my home issuing 30-day notices now looked like a man searching for the nearest exit. But Richard could not accept the defeat. His entire identity rested on his ability to dominate and intimidate those he deemed inferior. The sight of his own daughter sitting calmly at the end of the table, holding all the cards, shattered his fragile ego. The humiliation simmering in his chest began to boil over, transforming into raw, unfiltered rage. He pushed his chair back, gripping the edge of the wood and preparing to detonate. The quiet, intellectual dismantling was over. The loud, desperate explosion was about to begin. The quiet in the cabin broke with the sudden concussive strike of flesh hitting solid wood. Richard brought both of his closed fists down upon the dining table with staggering force. The impact rattled the stoneware mugs and sent a shockwave vibrating through the heavy floorboards beneath my boots. He shot up from his chair, knocking it backward until it crashed onto the woven rug. The meticulously crafted mask of the aloof corporate patriarch shattered into jagged pieces, revealing the terrified bully underneath. "You manipulated a dying woman," Richard roared, his voice echoing off the timber ceiling and bouncing back with deafening intensity. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk collar. For his entire adult life, my father solved his corporate disputes through sheer volume. When a contractor demanded fair pay or a partner requested transparency, Richard would simply shout them into submission. He built his wealth by filling boardrooms with so much noise and hostility that his opponents would surrender just to escape the verbal assault. He assumed the exact same tactic would crush the spirit of the daughter he always viewed as weak. "You isolated her up here in this god-forsaken wilderness," Richard continued, his chest heaving with exertion. "You intercepted our messages. You whispered poison into her ear while she was weak and vulnerable. You orchestrated this entire fraudulent scheme because you were jealous of the life we built down in the city. You stole my inheritance." Before the echoes of his tirade could even fade, Susan launched her own theatrical offensive. She gasped loudly, clutching the lapels of her designer blouse, as if she had just sustained a physical blow. She possessed a remarkable talent for weaponizing victimhood. During her numerous charity galas and country club luncheons, she perfected the art of drawing sympathetic attention. She could summon tears that never managed to ruin her expensive mascara. She pressed the back of her hand against her forehead, swaying slightly on her designer heels, to project immense emotional distress. You held her hostage, Susan cried out, forcing a noticeable tremor into her vocal cords. You kept her trapped in this freezing cabin and denied us access to our own mother. We tried to visit. We wanted to be here. But you made it impossible. You created a toxic environment and held her prisoner just so you could force her to sign those ridiculous papers. The sheer delusion required to utter those sentences defied basic logic. They chose to ignore the long, empty months where my phone sat silent. They erased the memory of the holidays they spent vacationing in tropical resorts, while I administered morphine injections in the dark. Susan was not speaking to me. She was workshopping a narrative. She was testing out the exact story she planned to tell her affluent friends and any potential judge who might listen. She needed to paint me as a calculating captor to wash the stain of neglect from her own pristine hands. Vanessa refused to be left out of the escalating chaos. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out her latest model smartphone. The bright screen illuminated her face in the dim lighting of the dining area, revealing an expression of pure, vindictive spite. I am dialing the county sheriff right now, Vanessa threatened, holding the device up like a loaded weapon. She tapped the glass screen with her manicured thumb, ensuring I could see the glowing numbers. Vanessa navigated her entire existence through screens and digital influence. She believed that authority figures existed solely to serve her immediate desires and punish anyone who inconvenienced her. You are going to prison, Adeline, Vanessa shouted, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. This is textbook elder abuse. You committed financial fraud against a vulnerable senior citizen. When the police see how you coerced her into changing the deed, they will arrest you on the spot. You will lose your nursing license. You will spend the next 10 years in a federal cell. She held her thumb hovering just over the call button. She waited for me to break. She expected me to lunge across the table, beg her to put the device away, and tear up the trust documents in a frantic plea for mercy. She wanted to see terror in my eyes. Lawson sensed the shifting current in the room. The attorney realized that brute intimidation might be their only remaining strategy. He smoothed the front of his charcoal suit jacket, recovering the smug posture he lost when Brenda presented the notary seal. He stepped forward, positioning himself as the legal executioner, ready to deliver the final killing stroke. My clients are entirely correct, Lawson stated, projecting his voice over the frantic accusations of my family. The legal term is undue influence, and any competent judge will recognize it the moment I file the injunction tomorrow morning. Lawson leaned over the table, planting his palms on the wood. He deployed legal and medical terminology, hoping to overwhelm my senses. Clara Harlow suffered from terminal respiratory failure. Lawson lectured, a condescending smirk returning to his lips. Do you know what happens to the human brain when the lungs stop processing oxygen efficiently, Adeline? Hypoxia sets in. Cognitive decline becomes inevitable. The patient experiences severe disorientation, memory loss, and dementia. A woman in that state lacks the testamentary capacity to execute a binding legal document. She did not know what she was signing. You took advantage of a delirious, hypoxic woman. He pointed toward the heavy ivory papers sitting in front of Brenda. I will subpoena her medical records. Lawson threatened, his eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. I will depose every single doctor who treated her. I will paint a picture of a suffocating, confused elderly woman manipulated by a greedy, opportunistic caregiver. I will drag this estate through civil litigation for the next decade. The legal fees alone will bankrupt you long before we ever reach a settlement. You will lose the cabin, the land, and every single dollar of that deferred compensation you think you earned. Tear up the trust right now, and we will agree not to press criminal charges. The room erupted into a suffocating cacophony of noise. Richard bellowed about stolen legacy. Susan wailed about kidnapping and emotional trauma. Vanessa shrieked about calling the authorities. Lawson barked threats of ruinous litigation and destroyed careers. They poured all of their panic, their greed, and their profound humiliation into a blinding wall of sound. They believed the sheer volume and intensity of their combined assault would crush my resolve. I remained seated at the far end of the oak table. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I did not reach out to stop Vanessa from making her phone call. I simply let them scream. Working in a high-volume emergency room teaches a person how to filter noise. When monitors blare alarms and patients thrash in pain, you learn to separate the frantic chaos from the clinical reality. You learn to steady your own pulse while the world unravels around you. I sat in my chair observing my family with the detached analytical gaze of a triage nurse assessing a psychiatric ward. I watched the spittle fly from my father's lips as he shouted until his throat turned raw. I watched Susan force shallow breaths to sustain her theatrical weeping. I watched Vanessa's thumb tremble over her glowing screen, lacking the actual courage to press the button and invite real police scrutiny. I watched Lawson try to mask his underlying panic with hollow legal bluster. The pressure in the cabin grew immense, but it bounced harmlessly off the armor I forged during 3 years of grueling winter isolation. I listened to the wind howling against the frosted window panes. I listened to the crackle of the burning pine logs inside the iron stove. I listened to the frantic, desperate gasps of 4 people drowning in the consequences of their own choices. I knew they possessed limited stamina. Their rage required a reaction to sustain its momentum. By denying them any response, I forced them to burn through their adrenaline reserves at an unsustainable rate. Their voices began to grow hoarse. Their chests heaved as they struggled to draw breath in the thin, high-altitude air. The screaming slowly fractured into heavy panting and exhausted glares. They ran out of threats. They ran out of oxygen. The chaotic eruption finally sputtered and died, leaving a strained, ringing silence in its wake. They stood around the table glaring at me, waiting for the devastated surrender they felt they had earned. They had deployed every weapon in their arsenal. Now it was my turn to dismantle their final remaining illusion. The chaotic echoes of their frantic shouting slowly absorbed into the heavy timber walls of the cabin, leaving a strained and breathless silence in their wake. My father leaned heavily against the back of his fallen wooden chair, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw oxygen into his lungs. Susan dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, her theatrical weeping exhausted by the sheer lack of an audience. Vanessa lowered her smartphone, her thumb remaining frozen above the screen, having never found the courage to dial the authorities. They all stared at me, waiting for the inevitable collapse they believed their combined intimidation had finally provoked. They assumed my quiet stillness indicated a fractured resolve. I kept my hands resting flat on the smooth surface of the dining table. I looked directly at Lawson. The slick out-of-state attorney stood tall, attempting to project an aura of unassailable legal dominance. He believed his rapid-fire delivery of medical jargon and courtroom threats had secured his victory. He thought he could leverage a fake dementia diagnosis to extort a surrender. "You speak with remarkable confidence for a man who has never checked a patient's oxygen saturation level," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air with icy precision. Lawson blinked, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. He opened his mouth to issue another legal warning, but I raised my hand, silencing him with the ingrained authority of a triage nurse directing a chaotic trauma bay. "You threw around the word hypoxia like a blunt instrument trying to sound authoritative." I continued, my tone clinical and detached. "It is true that severely deprived oxygen levels can induce cognitive decline and disorientation. However, you failed to account for the fact that Clara was not left to suffocate alone in the dark. She lived with a licensed medical professional who monitored her vitals every 4 hours around the clock." I detailed the physiological reality of my grandmother's care, ensuring the attorney understood the depth of his miscalculation. I explained how her supplemental oxygen flow was meticulously titrated to maintain her saturation levels above 94% at all times. I managed her arterial blood gas levels, balancing her medications to prevent any toxic buildup of carbon dioxide in her bloodstream. She did not experience a single hour of hypoxia under my watch. Her brain received a steady, optimal supply of oxygen, preserving her brilliant intellect right up until her final day. My nursing license requires me to chart everything I stated, locking eyes with the sweating lawyer. We are trained to anticipate every possible complication. When a patient receives a terminal diagnosis, we also learn to anticipate the inevitable arrival of estranged relatives who suddenly appear holding empty bags and demanding a payout. I knew the moment Clara took her last breath, Richard would hire someone exactly like you. A man who weaponizes medical ignorance to terrorize grieving families. I stood up from my chair at the end of the oak table. The sudden movement caused Vanessa to flinch, stepping backward. I turned toward Brenda. The local notary sat quietly observing the dismantling of the corporate intruders. Brenda offered a subtle nod of profound respect. I reached across the wood and slid my hand into the rear pocket of her weathered leather folder. My fingers closed around thick, heavy paper. I withdrew 3 separate sealed envelopes. They were pristine white, stark against the dark, rustic backdrop of the cabin. Each envelope bore the embossed crimson wax seal of a premier medical institution located down in Denver. I tossed the 3 envelopes down the length of the long dining table. They slid across the polished oak, coming to a halt directly in front of Lawson's expensive leather briefcase. Lawson stared at the sealed documents. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. He did not reach out to touch them. His predatory instincts warned him that those white envelopes contained the exact instruments of his professional demise. "You threatened to subpoena her medical records," I said, walking slowly around the edge of the table, closing the distance between us. "You promised to depose every doctor who treated her in a grand theatrical effort to prove she lacked testamentary capacity. I decided to save you the filing fees and the travel expenses." I explained the logistical operation Claire and I orchestrated over the past 12 months. Knowing Richard would eventually attempt to invalidate any legal document she signed, we initiated a preemptive strike. I utilized my professional network from the Denver hospital to contact 3 independent board-certified neurologists. These were not local mountain practitioners. They were leading state-certified experts in cognitive decline and neurodegenerative diseases. Over the course of her final year, Clara underwent rigorous psychological and cognitive evaluations. We conducted the initial assessments through secure telehealth portals, followed by discreet in-person visits whenever the doctors traveled up the mountain for weekend retreats. They administered comprehensive exams designed to detect even the slightest hint of dementia, Alzheimer's, or memory fragmentation. The contents of those 3 envelopes represent their certified sworn findings, I instructed Lawson, pointing to the pristine paper. "Go ahead and open them, counselor." Lawson remained perfectly still, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Richard stepped forward, his earlier rage transforming into a desperate, frantic confusion. He looked from the lawyer to the envelopes, unable to comprehend how his ironclad strategy was unraveling. "Allow me to summarize the results, since you seem hesitant to read them," I offered, my voice echoing with undeniable finality. Clara scored a flawless 30 out of 30 on every single Montreal cognitive assessment she took. All 3 independent neurologists explicitly state in their sworn affidavits that Clara Harlow possessed pristine lucid testamentary capacity. They verified she showed 0 signs of cognitive impairment, 0 signs of disorientation, and 0 evidence of undue influence. The silence returning to the room felt heavier than the winter storm outside. The family realized the magnitude of the trap they had marched blindly into. They could not dispute the findings of 3 separate specialized medical experts. They could not argue that I coerced a confused old woman when those envelopes contained undeniable proof of her sharp, sovereign intellect. I tapped the final envelope resting nearest to Lawson's trembling hand. "That particular evaluation," I noted, my tone dropping to a chilling whisper, "is dated exactly 72 hours before Brenda notarized the irrevocable living trust." The trap snapped shut with a resounding clinical finality. The legal loophole Lawson desperately attempted to pry open slammed shut, severing his entire strategy. He could no longer claim Clara was delirious when she signed the paperwork. He could no longer frame me as a manipulative captor. The certified medical documents formed an impenetrable shield around the estate, making the living trust entirely bulletproof. I leaned closer to the attorney, ensuring my next words registered deep within his calculating mind. If you attempt to file an injunction based on a fabricated claim of undue influence, I warned him, keeping my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. I will not just defeat you in court. I will hand these 3 certified evaluations to the judge. I will expose your willful intent to submit knowingly false medical claims to a judicial body. Then I will file a ruinous countersuit against you and your firm for frivolous litigation and malicious prosecution. Lawson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight collar. The realization of his perilous situation washed over him, but I will not stop there. I continued, stripping away the last remnants of his false authority. I will forward the court transcripts and these medical affidavits directly to the Ethics Committee of the State Bar Association. I will ensure they launch a full investigation into your predatory practices. You will spend the next 5 years fighting to keep your legal license and defending your firm against malpractice suits. You wanted to drag this estate into a decade of litigation. I am offering to drag your entire career into the dirt. My medical expertise had just checkmated his high-priced legal maneuvering. I did not need to shout or pound my fists on the table to assert dominance. I merely utilized the truth backed by irrefutable data and certified signatures. I turned the very weapon he tried to use against me, the threat of the legal system, into a guillotine hovering directly over his own neck. Richard watched his expensive attorney crumble. The patriarch of the family, who always bought his way out of every inconvenience, realized his money held zero value in this room. He could not purchase a new reality. He could not bribe 3 independent neurologists to change their sworn affidavits. He was marooned in the freezing wilderness, stripped of his assets, his dignity, and his hired protection. Vanessa backed away from the dining table, her shoulders slumping in profound defeat. The arrogant sneer she wore since arriving at the cemetery dissolved into a blank mask of shock. Susan sank slowly into a nearby rocking chair, burying her face in her hands. They finally understood the true cost of their 3-year absence. They had underestimated a dying matriarch and dismissed an exhausted nurse, assuming we were easy prey. Lawson stared down at the 3 sealed envelopes. He calculated the risks, weighing the lucrative timber commission against the total destruction of his professional livelihood. He was a predator who only hunted the weak. He never engaged in battles he could not easily win. And as he slowly pulled his hands away from the oak table, resigning himself to the undeniable mathematical reality of his defeat, I knew the mountain had finally broken them. Lawson reached forward with profound hesitation. His manicured fingers hovered over the pristine white envelopes before finally grasping the closest one. He broke the crimson wax seal. The tearing of the thick paper sounded abnormally loud in the quiet dining room. He withdrew the certified affidavit, unfolding the crisp document, smoothing it flat against the oak table. His eyes darted back and forth across the page, scanning the dense medical terminology and the heavy official stamps of the Denver Neurological Institute. He read the flawless scores on the cognitive assessments. He read the sworn testimony of the attending physician, verifying Clara Harlow possessed a sharp, unclouded intellect. The color drained from his face, leaving his complexion the shade of damp ash. He opened the second envelope and then the third. Each document hammered another nail into the coffin of his legal strategy. Lawson operated as a scavenger within the legal system. His entire career relied on finding vulnerable targets like grieving widows, exhausted siblings, or underfunded heirs, and burying them under a mountain of intimidating paperwork. He possessed zero interest in actual justice. He hunted for easy settlements, prioritizing swift intimidation over prolonged courtroom battles. He only engaged when he held a distinct, overwhelming advantage. Staring at the 3 certified neurological evaluations, he recognized the cold, undeniable truth. He held no advantage here. He was standing in a fortress built by a woman who anticipated his every move, and he was currently staring down a licensed medical professional armed with the exact documentation required to end his career. The predator realized he had just walked into a steel trap. He stacked the 3 affidavits together, aligning the edges with meticulous care. He slid them back across the table, pushing them away from his space, as if the paper itself might burn him. He reached for the brass latches of his expensive leather briefcase. The dual metallic clicks echoed sharply through the room, signaling the official collapse of his authority. He began organizing his pens and yellow legal pads, tucking them neatly inside the velvet-lined compartments. He moved with the swift, practiced efficiency of a man preparing a rapid retreat. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, his voice returning as a harsh, desperate rasp. "You need to draft the injunction. You need to call the local judge and file an emergency order to freeze this estate." Lawson closed the lid of his briefcase, securing the heavy brass locks. He did not look at my father right away. He took a moment to adjust the cuffs of his tailored suit, projecting a facade of calm professionalism to mask his internal panic. When he finally turned to face Richard, his expression held nothing but profound professional disgust. "I am returning to Denver," Lawson stated, his tone devoid of the slick charm he had utilized earlier. "I am closing this file and I am washing my hands of this entire disastrous endeavor." Richard stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, furious red. "You cannot leave," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the attorney. "I retained your services. I paid for top-tier legal representation. You are going to take those ridiculous medical letters and you are going to tear them apart in a courtroom. You are going to do your job." Lawson picked up his briefcase, holding it firmly by the leather handle. He looked at Richard the way a person looks at a discarded piece of trash on the sidewalk. "You did not retain me to commit professional suicide, Richard," the lawyer replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "You hired me to execute a simple probate liquidation. You assured me this was a straightforward matter concerning a delirious old woman and a naive granddaughter. You failed to mention that the granddaughter was a registered nurse who spent the last 12 months building an impenetrable legal and medical defense." Lawson gestured toward Brenda and the leather folder sitting on the table. "That living trust is bulletproof," Lawson explained, emphasizing every word to ensure the harsh reality penetrated my father's stubborn skull. "The property transfer occurred prior to death. The notary verified the signatures. And those 3 certified medical affidavits eliminate any possibility of claiming undue influence. There is no judge in the state of Colorado who will grant an injunction against this estate. If I file that motion, Adeline will hand those evaluations to the ethics committee. I will not risk my license and my livelihood fighting a losing battle just because you were too arrogant to realize your own mother outsmarted you." Susan gasped, wrapping her arms around her own torso. "You are abandoning us," she whispered, staring at the attorney in disbelief. Lawson turned his cold gaze toward my mother. "I am mitigating my liabilities, Susan. There is a distinct difference." The slick attorney reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a sleek digital card reader. He plugged the small square device into the charging port of his smartphone. He tapped the glowing screen a few times, bringing up a payment application. He held the device out toward Richard. "Before I depart, I require immediate settlement for my travel expenses and my hourly consultation fee." Lawson demanded, his tone shifting into a rigid transactional register. "The total comes to $4,200. I expect payment right now." Richard stared at the digital screen, unable to comprehend the rapid deterioration of his power. "You expect me to pay you after you just surrendered?" He choked out, his voice shaking with raw indignation. "You did nothing but read a few papers and fold." "I provided you with a definitive legal assessment," Lawson countered, stepping closer and thrusting the device toward Richard's chest. "My assessment is that you have zero claim to this property and zero chance of winning a lawsuit. I saved you hundreds of thousands of dollars in ruinous litigation fees. You will pay my retainer right now, or I will place a lien on your primary residence in the city before the sun rises tomorrow." The threat hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Richard knew Lawson possessed the exact predatory skills to execute that threat. The lawyer who built a career tearing down vulnerable families was now turning those exact weapons upon his own client. My father was trapped. He reached into his coat pocket with trembling fingers and withdrew a heavy metal credit card. He inserted the chip into the digital reader. The machine beeped a high-pitched electronic chirp that signaled the final transfer of funds. Lawson withdrew the card and handed it back to Richard. He pulled up his collar and turned his back on the family. He did not say goodbye. He walked straight through the living room, ignoring the antique furniture and the tagged items. He reached the heavy oak door, twisting the iron handle and pulling it open. The fierce winter wind rushed into the cabin, bringing a swirl of fresh snow across the woven welcome mat. Lawson stepped out into the freezing storm, pulling the door shut behind him with a heavy, definitive thud. The sound of that closing door severed the final thread of hope sustaining my family. Their hired muscle had evaporated, taking their confidence and their arrogance with him. They had brought a wolf to hunt me, but the wolf recognized a stronger predator and fled into the woods. The poetic justice of the moment resonated deep within my chest. Lawson abandoned them in their moment of profound defeat, just as quickly and clinically as they had abandoned Clara in her moment of profound need. They were finally experiencing the exact bitter taste of betrayal they had forced me to swallow for 3 long years. I remained standing at the far end of the oak table. The rustic dining room, once filled with their loud demands and their threatening bluster, now held nothing but the quiet crackle of the wood stove. Brenda sat silently sipping the last drops of her chamomile tea, a subtle smile of satisfaction gracing her weathered face. I looked down the length of the table at the 3 strangers who shared my bloodline. Richard stood with his shoulders slumped, staring blankly at the spot where his attorney had just stood. Susan remained frozen in the rocking chair, her theatrical tears replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. Vanessa held her expensive phone in a loose grip, the screen having long since gone dark. They were marooned. They possessed no legal recourse, no financial leverage, and no intimidating allies to hide behind. The illusion of their superiority had been systematically dismantled, leaving them exposed and defenseless in a house that belonged entirely to me. I was the undisputed master of this domain, and the time had come to issue my final directive. The rumble of Lawson's luxury sedan starting up in the driveway echoed through the frosted window panes. We all listened as his tires spun briefly on the ice before gripping the gravel and accelerating down the mountain. The fading sound of his engine took the last remnants of my family's false courage with it. They stood in the center of the rustic dining room, stripped of their legal protection and stripped of their unearned confidence. The cabin felt remarkably still. Only the ticking of the brass mantel clock and the crackle of the wood stove punctuated the silence. I looked at the 3 people who shared my genetics. Richard, the corporate titan who fired employees with a snap of his fingers, now stared at the floorboards, unable to meet his youngest daughter's gaze. Susan, the socialite who navigated Denver high society with effortless grace, looked diminished and fragile standing in her designer boots. Vanessa, the older sister, who spent her entire youth confiscating my belongings and demanding the spotlight, clutched her dead smartphone with white knuckles. They were waiting for me to scream. They anticipated a dramatic monologue filled with bitter accusations and demands for tearful apologies. They braced themselves for a theatrical family meltdown. I denied them that spectacle. Seeking an apology requires holding on to the hope that the other party possesses a conscience capable of remorse. I discarded that hope during my 2nd year on this mountain. I did not want their remorse. I did not want their tearful explanations or their hollow promises to do better. I simply wanted them gone. I stepped away from the oak table and walked into the center of the room, crossing the invisible line that separated the dining area from the living room. My winter boots made steady, deliberate sounds against the hardwood. I stopped a few feet away from my father. "You are no longer welcome in this house, Richard." I stated, my voice level and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. "The deed is registered in my name. The living trust is in full effect. You currently stand on private property without the consent of the owner. Under Colorado law, that constitutes criminal trespassing." Richard blinked his mind, struggling to process the clinical reality of my statement. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer a desperate negotiation or a feeble excuse, but the sheer authority radiating from my posture forced him to snap his jaw shut. He possessed no leverage to negotiate and no currency I desired. I turned my attention to my older sister. Vanessa stood near the stone fireplace, her mink collar pulled tight around her neck. Throughout our entire childhood, she operated under the assumption that whatever belonged to me could be claimed as her own. If I received a gift she coveted, she would simply take it knowing our parents would force me to share to keep the peace. She carried that exact entitlement into adulthood, believing she could walk into a grieving household and tag heirlooms like a contestant on a game show. I pointed toward the brass mantel clock and the vintage wooden rocking chair. The neon pink sticky notes she had attached earlier glared brightly against the muted antique surfaces. Vanessa, I want you to walk over there and remove those pink labels I instructed, keeping my tone as smooth as polished river stone. You will peel every single one of them off my furniture, and you will place them in the trash can. If you attempt to leave this property carrying so much as a silver teaspoon or a vintage brooch, I will not hesitate. I will press formal charges for attempted theft. Vanessa gasped, her eyes widening in profound shock. The idea of facing criminal charges over antique decor shattered her curated reality. For a brief moment, she looked toward our mother, expecting Susan to intervene and scold me for being unreasonable. But Susan offered zero protection. My mother simply stared at the floor, paralyzed by the undeniable shift in power. Recognizing she possessed no allies, Vanessa yielded to the reality of the situation. She stepped toward the brass mantel clock with trembling hands. I watched my haughty older sister peel her neon pink tag off the polished metal. She moved to the rocking chair and retrieved the second label. The humiliating act of undoing her own greedy presumptions played out in agonizing slow motion. She crumpled the sticky paper into a tight ball and dropped it into the small wicker wastebasket near the front door. She did not dare look me in the eye. I checked my watch, noting the exact position of the hands. I am giving you exactly 5 minutes to gather your luggage and vacate my property, I announced, my voice carrying the unyielding finality of a judge delivering a sentence. If you are still standing inside this cabin when that 5 minutes expires, I will pick up my phone and dial the county sheriff. Richard bristled at the threat, attempting to muster a fraction of his former bluster. You would not call the police on your own family, he muttered, though his voice lacked any genuine conviction. I offered him a cold, knowing smile. You clearly do not know the local law enforcement, Richard. Sheriff Miller grew up in this valley. He patrols this mountain road every single evening. During the weeks when the snow trapped my car in the driveway, Sheriff Miller drove his reinforced cruiser up here to deliver our prescription medications and firewood. He sat by the stove and drank coffee with Clara. He knows exactly who I am, and more importantly, he knows exactly who you are because Clara told him every detail about the children who abandoned her. He would be more than delighted to drive up here and escort 3 trespassers off the ridge in handcuffs. The mention of Sheriff Miller extinguished the final ember of resistance burning inside my father. Richard knew local mountain cops harbored zero patience for arrogant city developers. The threat of public arrest and the ensuing social scandal down in Denver terrified him far more than losing the timber rights. He realized the battle was definitively over. The retreat that followed was a masterpiece of frantic humiliation. The confident invaders who marched through my front door an hour ago scrambled to collect their belongings with clumsy, desperate urgency. Richard grabbed his hard-shell suitcase, dragging it across the floor without bothering to lift it over the threshold. Susan shoved her arms into her heavy winter coat, forgetting to button it as she practically ran toward the exit. Vanessa snatched her designer tote bags, her face flushed scarlet with profound embarrassment. They did not offer any parting words. They did not attempt to manufacture a polite farewell. They simply fled. I walked to the front entryway and pulled the heavy oak door wide open. The frigid evening wind swept across the porch, instantly dropping the temperature inside the foyer. I stood in the doorway watching the chaotic scene unfold in the snow-covered driveway. The sun had completely vanished behind the jagged peaks, leaving the mountain bathed in deep blue twilight. My parents and my sister struggled to load their pristine leather luggage into the back of their rented luxury vehicles. The freezing temperature stiffened their fingers, making the simple act of turning the car keys a difficult chore. Richard cursed loudly as his expensive shoes slipped on the icy gravel, forcing him to grab the door handle to prevent a fall. They looked entirely out of place, a collection of wealthy tourists severely underestimating the harsh environment they sought to exploit. Engines roared to life, their headlights piercing the gathering darkness. I leaned against the wooden door frame, crossing my arms over my chest. I watched the first SUV shift into reverse. The tires spun wildly, throwing a spray of frozen mud into the air, before finally catching traction. Richard executed a clumsy three-point turn in the narrow driveway, his headlights briefly illuminating the front porch where I stood. I did not wave, I did not move. I remained a steadfast, silent sentinel guarding the fortress Clara and I had built together. The three vehicles aligned in a convoy and began their slow, treacherous descent down the winding mountain road. The red glow of their taillights faded, gradually disappearing around the first sharp bend, obscured by the dense wall of pine trees. The rumbling sound of their engines slowly dissolved into the steady howl of the winter wind until nothing remained but the pristine silence of the forest. I stood there for a long time, letting the freezing air wash over my face. The toxic tether that bound me to their approval, their expectations, and their relentless exploitation snapped. The immense weight I carried for 29 years lifted from my shoulders, floating away into the dark Colorado night. I was no longer the discarded daughter or the convenient caregiver. I was the sole proprietor of my own life and the undeniable master of this mountain. The brutal Colorado winter eventually surrendered to the steady warmth of the spring thaw. 4 months had passed since those three luxury vehicles retreated down the icy mountain road. I stood on the wooden front porch of the cabin, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The heavy snowdrifts that once buried the front yard had melted into rushing streams of clear water, cutting through the dark soil. Green pine needles emerged from the frost, and the sharp scent of damp earth filled the morning air. I was alone on the 40-acre ridge, but for the first time in 3 years, I did not feel lonely. The suffocating weight of my family's expectations had vanished, leaving behind a deep, unshakable peace. The property was legally mine. The deed rested securely in a fireproof lockbox down in the valley. No commercial developers would ever drive bulldozers through this ancient forest. No slick lawyers would ever measure these trees for profit. Clara retained her sanctuary and I reclaimed my future. The living trust contained more than just the real estate. The liquid assets Clara preserved provided a significant financial foundation. I did not use that money to purchase designer handbags or book first-class flights to tropical resorts. I knew exactly what it cost to survive in these high altitudes when the body begins to fail. I remembered the terrifying nights when the power grid went dark, and I had to rely on my own medical instincts to keep my grandmother breathing. I wanted to ensure no other family in this remote region ever had to face that darkness alone. I utilized the capital to establish an independent home care consultancy serving the rural mountain communities. I purchased reliable 4-wheel drive medical transport vehicles and hired a small, dedicated team of licensed nurses who understood the unique challenges of high-elevation care. We provided oxygen management, palliative support, and emergency medical coordination for elderly residents living off the main grid. Brenda handled all the municipal permits and the corporate filings, her notary stamp sealing every official document. We named the agency Clara Harlow Rural Care. It stood as a living testament to her resilience. Every time my team drove up a treacherous dirt road to check a patient's vital signs, we honored the woman who refused to let greedy heirs dictate her legacy. My days became filled with genuine purpose. I spent my time surrounded by people who valued sincerity and hard work over superficial status. Down in the city, the consequences of the winter confrontation rippled through the Denver high society. Wealthy social circles operate on a strict currency of reputation and perceived success. My family spent decades cultivating an image of flawless prosperity. But secrets rarely stay buried when legal documents are filed in public county records. Word regarding the true nature of Clara's living trust began to circulate through the country club locker rooms and the charity gala planning committees. The truth is a relentless force. People learned that Richard Harlow, the titan of corporate acquisitions, had been legally disinherited by his own mother for abandonment. The details of the caregiver clause, and the $250,000 penalty ledger leaked into his professional sphere. Former business partners suddenly declined Richard's invitations to play golf, citing scheduling conflicts that never seemed to resolve. His reputation as a ruthless but honorable businessman disintegrated. Investors pulled their backing from his real estate ventures, wary of associating with a man who attempted to defraud the nurse keeping his mother alive. Susan faced a similar social exile. Her fellow board members on various philanthropic committees quietly suggested she step down to deal with her private family matters. The pristine socialite who once commanded the room at every charity luncheon found herself sitting alone at her country club table. The other wives offered polite nods but maintained a vast chilling distance. Vanessa attempted to maintain her digital illusions, posting curated photos from expensive restaurants. But the veneer of her perfect life had shattered. The comments section of her social media feeds quickly turned hostile as anonymous users asked why she tried to steal a cabin from the woman who kept her grandmother breathing. She lost the very social status she sacrificed Clara to protect. They were marooned in their opulent penthouse surrounded by expensive furniture, but entirely bankrupt in the currency of human connection. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching a pair of red-tailed hawks circle above the jagged peaks. The morning sun warmed my face. I thought about the journey that brought me to this exact moment. I thought about the terrified, exhausted girl who drove up this mountain 3 years ago, and the woman who stood here now holding the deed to her own life. I want to speak directly to you now. I know many of you listening have walked a similar path. You understand what it feels like to be the designated caretaker, the reliable sibling, or the quiet daughter who always steps up when things get hard. You know the unique, agonizing pain of watching the people who share your bloodlines treat your sacrifices like an endless buffet meant for their consumption. They mistake your compassion for weakness. They assume your willingness to help means you lack the spine to defend yourself. They drain your energy, your finances, and your youth, believing you will never demand a settling of the accounts. Let me tell you something vital about self-worth. True wealth does not reside in a slate-gray cashmere overcoat or a rented luxury vehicle. It is not found in the posturing of a hired attorney who threatens you with legal jargon. True wealth is the quiet, unshakable confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you have endured and precisely what you have earned. When toxic people attempt to erase your reality, you do not need to match their frantic volume. You do not need to scream or plead for them to acknowledge your value. They will never give you the validation you deserve, because acknowledging your worth requires them to confront their own severe deficits. Instead, you must become a meticulous architect of your own defense. You gather your receipts, you document the truth, you build your boundaries with the cold, hard facts that no amount of gaslighting can dismantle. You keep your own ledger. Silence is not submission. Sometimes silence is merely the time you take to let arrogant people dig a hole deep enough to swallow their own pride. When the moment comes to enforce your boundaries, you do not negotiate. You present the undeniable evidence and you hold your ground. You force them to read the exact price of their negligence. You are allowed to walk away from people who demand your warmth while leaving you out in the freezing snow. You are allowed to protect your peace. Blood does not obligate you to endure exploitation, and family duty is not a suicide pact. You have the right to close the door on anyone who views your kindness as an exploitable resource. You owe them nothing and you owe yourself everything. If my journey resonated with your own experiences, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button. Leave a comment sharing your own stories of setting boundaries and reclaiming your independence. I read your words, and I find strength in knowing we are not fighting these battles alone. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that their sacrifices matter and their strength is valid. Thank you for listening to my story. My name is Adeline Harlow, and I am finally home.
The American dream has long been painted in broad, glittering strokes: a sprawling house with a manicured lawn, a prestigious job title, luxury vehicles resting in the driveway, and a closet lined with fine cashmere. We are culturally conditioned to chase these external markers of success, sprinting on a relentless treadmill of accumulation. Yet, as the harrowing story of the Harlow family reveals, a home can be architecturally flawless while remaining spiritually barren. Beneath the surface of legal battles and dramatic betrayals, this saga serves as a profound, uncompromising mirror held up to modern parenting, family responsibility, and the legacy we leave for our children. When we strip away the dramatic estate dispute and the chilling legal maneuvers, the tragedy of Richard and Susan Harlow is fundamentally a failure of emotional awareness and parental duty. In a society that often glorifies individualism and material triumph, their story is a quiet alarm bell. It asks us to re-examine the very foundation of the traditional family structure, urging us to weave honesty, fairness, and deep moral resilience back into the fabric of how we raise the next generation. Children are unequivocally the most accurate mirrors of our own character. They do not learn how to navigate the world by listening to our polished lectures. They learn by observing what we do when we think no one is watching. Richard and Susan abandoned an ailing, fragile matriarch to chase the hollow warmth of luxury vacations and country club status. In doing so, they provided a devastatingly clear lesson to their daughters. They demonstrated that love is transactional and that human beings lose their value the moment they become inconvenient. To instill a genuine sense of filial piety and familial responsibility, parents must be the first to step into the grueling, unglamorous trenches of duty. The presence you offer during a crisis, the hand you hold in a sterile hospital room, and the silent sacrifices you make carry a directional weight far heavier than any financial inheritance you could ever leave behind. We must also critically redefine the metric of success for our children. The modern world insists on measuring worth through tax brackets, zip codes, and corporate titles. However, true, enduring success is found in the quiet architecture of a person's soul, in their dignity, their compassion, and their unyielding honesty. Adeline was dismissed and marginalized by her own bloodline because she sacrificed her professional trajectory to become a caregiver. Her family looked at her worn boots and saw failure. They failed to realize that the silent, exhausting dedication she poured into keeping her grandmother breathing was a form of wealth that cannot be quantified on a spreadsheet. Parents hold the profound responsibility of teaching their children to honor these quiet contributions. When we celebrate empathy and selflessness, with the same fervor we celebrate a straight-A report card or a varsity trophy, we cultivate a spirit that cannot be manipulated or corrupted by money. Furthermore, a healthy family structure demands that love remains entirely unconditional and divorced from utility. A child is an independent, sovereign soul, not a tool to be leveraged for parental convenience. The Harlows weaponized Adeline's nursing license, twisting her intrinsic compassion into a chain of indentured servitude. They exploited her under the guise of family duty, draining her youth to preserve their own comfort. Traditional education and family cohesion emphasize deep connection, but this connection must never translate to control. We must raise our children to know they are cherished for exactly who they are, not for the free labor, the bragging rights, or the reflected glory they can provide. This brings us to the crucial necessity of building resilience and establishing personal boundaries. Adeline stands as a towering archetype of quiet fortitude. She did not defeat her family's bullying through physical force or screaming matches. She dismantled their cruelty using the quiet, undeniable power of truth, medical evidence, and legal preparation. As parents, one of the most vital survival skills we can pass down is the confidence to say no. We must equip our children with the emotional vocabulary to define their boundaries, even against those who share their bloodline. A child raised to respect their own inherent dignity will never allow themselves to be trampled, nor will they ever seek to trample another. They learn that true strength does not require volume. This strength is inextricably linked to the courage required to face one's own mistakes. When confronted with the undeniable proof of their neglect, the Harlow family erupted into a frantic theater of gaslighting, threats, and denial. They attempted to manipulate reality rather than face the stinging pain of accountability. A robust, healthy family is built on the bedrock of honesty, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. Teaching a child integrity means showing them how to lower their ego, admit when they have caused harm, and undertake the difficult work of making amends. Deception and psychological manipulation only create irreparable fractures in the foundation of trust. Blending the inherent American values of independence and self-reliance with the profound moral depth of traditional family responsibility creates a powerful paradigm. It raises a generation that is not only capable of surviving the competitive modern world, but doing so with a compassionate, unyielding spine. It cultivates individuals who are fiercely independent, yet deeply tethered to the people who truly matter. These are the quiet, often painful lessons that shape the trajectory of a human life. If you find yourself captivated by these complex explorations of karmic justice, the psychological dynamics of family, and the profound strength of the human spirit, I invite you to follow the channel Orange Vengeance. Here we delve into the stories that remind us of our own resilience, peeling back the polished layers of society to reveal the raw, undeniable truths beneath. As you step away from the story of the Harlows, the noise of their frantic defeat fades, leaving only a lingering heavy silence. Imagine standing in the center of your own home, the evening light casting long shadows across the floorboards. You look around at the walls you have built, the photographs on the mantel, and the life you have carefully curated. When the rush of the day ends and the external world strips away, a haunting question remains suspended in the quiet air. If the people who depend on you were to hold a mirror up to your choices, your sacrifices, and your unspoken priorities, what reflection would actually stare back? And in the final accounting of your life, when all the luxury and status has turned to dust, will you be surrounded by the warmth of those you truly loved, or will you find yourself standing entirely irrevocably alone? The American dream has long been painted in broad, glittering strokes. A sprawling house with a manicured lawn, a prestigious job title, luxury vehicles resting in the driveway, and a closet lined with fine cashmere. We are culturally conditioned to chase these external markers of success, sprinting on a relentless treadmill of accumulation. Yet, as the harrowing story of the Harlow family reveals, a home can be architecturally flawless while remaining spiritually barren. Beneath the surface of legal battles and dramatic betrayals, this saga serves as a profound, uncompromising mirror held up to modern parenting, family responsibility, and the legacy we leave for our children. When we strip away the dramatic estate dispute and the chilling legal maneuvers, the tragedy of Richard and Susan Harlow is fundamentally a failure of emotional awareness and parental duty. In a society that often glorifies individualism and material triumph, their story is a quiet alarm bell. It asks us to re-examine the very foundation of the traditional family structure, urging us to weave honesty, fairness, and deep moral resilience back into the fabric of how we raise the next generation. Children are unequivocally the most accurate mirrors of our own character. They do not learn how to navigate the world by listening to our polished lectures. They learn by observing what we do when we think no one is watching. Richard and Susan abandoned an ailing, fragile matriarch to chase the hollow warmth of luxury vacations and country club status. In doing so, they provided a devastatingly clear lesson to their daughters. They demonstrated that love is transactional and that human beings lose their value the moment they become inconvenient. To instill a genuine sense of filial piety and familial responsibility, parents must be the first to step into the grueling, unglamorous trenches of duty. The presence you offer during a crisis, the hand you hold in a sterile hospital room, and the silent sacrifices you make carry a directional weight far heavier than any financial inheritance you could ever leave behind. We must also critically redefine the metric of success for our children. The modern world insists on measuring worth through tax brackets, zip codes, and corporate titles. However, true enduring success is found in the quiet architecture of a person's soul, in their dignity, their compassion, and their unyielding honesty. Adeline was dismissed and marginalized by her own bloodline because she sacrificed her professional trajectory to become a caregiver. Her family looked at her worn boots and saw failure. They failed to realize that the silent, exhausting dedication she poured into keeping her grandmother breathing was a form of wealth that cannot be quantified on a spreadsheet. Parents hold the profound responsibility of teaching their children to honor these quiet contributions. When we celebrate empathy and selflessness with the same fervor we celebrate a straight-A report card or a varsity trophy, we cultivate a spirit that cannot be manipulated or corrupted by money. Furthermore, a healthy family structure demands that love remains entirely unconditional and divorced from utility. A child is an independent, sovereign soul, not a tool to be leveraged for parental convenience. The Harlows weaponized Adeline's nursing license, twisting her intrinsic compassion into a chain of indentured servitude. They exploited her under the guise of family duty, draining her youth to preserve their own comfort. Traditional education and family cohesion emphasize deep connection, but this connection must never translate to control. We must raise our children to know they are cherished for exactly who they are, not for the free labor, the bragging rights, or the reflected glory they can provide. This brings us to the crucial necessity of building resilience and establishing personal boundaries. Adeline stands as a towering archetype of quiet fortitude. She did not defeat her family's bullying through physical force or screaming matches. She dismantled their cruelty using the quiet, undeniable power of truth, medical evidence, and legal preparation. As parents, one of the most vital survival skills we can pass down is the confidence to say no. We must equip our children with the emotional vocabulary to define their boundaries, even against those who share their bloodline. A child raised to respect their own inherent dignity will never allow themselves to be trampled, nor will they ever seek to trample another. They learn that true strength does not require volume. This strength is inextricably linked to the courage required to face one's own mistakes. When confronted with the undeniable proof of their neglect, the Harlow family erupted into a frantic theater of gaslighting, threats, and denial. They attempted to manipulate reality rather than face the stinging pain of accountability. A robust, healthy family is built on the bedrock of honesty, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. Teaching a child integrity means showing them how to lower their ego, admit when they have caused harm, and undertake the difficult work of making amends. Deception and psychological manipulation only create irreparable fractures in the foundation of trust. Blending the inherent American values of independence and self-reliance with the profound moral depth of traditional family responsibility creates a powerful paradigm. It raises a generation that is not only capable of surviving the competitive modern world, but doing so with a compassionate, unyielding spine. It cultivates individuals who are fiercely independent yet deeply tethered to the people who truly matter. These are the quiet, often painful lessons that shape the trajectory of a human life. If you find yourself captivated by these complex explorations of karmic justice, the psychological dynamics of family, and the profound strength of the human spirit, I invite you to follow the channel Orange Vengeance. Here we delve into the stories that remind us of our own resilience, peeling back the polished layers of society to reveal the raw, undeniable truths beneath. As you step away from the story of the Harlows, the noise of their frantic defeat fades, leaving only a lingering, heavy silence. Imagine standing in the center of your own home, the evening light casting long shadows across the floorboards. You look around at the walls you have built, the photographs on the mantel, and the life you have carefully curated. When the rush of the day ends and the external world strips away, a haunting question remains suspended in the quiet air. If the people who depend on you were to hold a mirror up to your choices, your sacrifices, and your unspoken priorities, what reflection would actually stare back? And in the final accounting of your life, when all the luxury and status has turned to dust, will you be surrounded by the warmth of those you truly loved? Or will you find yourself standing entirely, irrevocably alone?